Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking marital secrets. Picture this. The year is 1885, London. A wealthy couple retires for the evening. But here is what would astound us today. They walk into separate bedrooms, close their doors, and sleep alone. Not because they are fighting, not because their marriage has failed, but because doctors, society, and even the law told them this was the proper, healthy, and moral way to be married. For nearly a century, sharing a bed with your own spouse was considered dangerous, improper, and even deadly. Tonight, we uncover why. So before we step into this fascinating world together, I have a small request. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden corners of history with me, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. And I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I love reading your thoughts, your stories, your perspectives from around the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us drift back in time together. Imagine you were a guest at an elegant dinner party in Victorian London, sometime around 1880. The gaslights flicker against silk wallpaper. Crystal glasses clink. Laughter echoes through the parlour. You've been invited to stay the night at this grand townhouse, and as the evening winds down, a servant discreetly shows you to your room. As you walk down the hallway, you notice something peculiar. The master bedroom has two doors, two separate entrances, and when you peek inside the next morning you realise the truth. The husband and wife of this house do not share a bed. In fact, they do not even share a room. At first you might think, oh, they must be having problems. But no, everyone acts as though this is perfectly normal, because in their world it is. Between the 1850s and 1950s, nearly a full century, separate beds for married couples were not just accepted. They were recommended, encouraged, advertised, praised by doctors as the height of modern scientific living. Now, let us sit with that for a moment. Think about how shocking this sounds to us today. We live in a world where sleeping apart from your partner often carries a stigma. People whisper, "Are they okay? Is the relationship in trouble?" Couples therapists write articles about the importance of physical closeness. Mattress companies sell us queen and king-size beds specifically designed for two. The entire concept of cuddling up together is romanticized in movies, songs, novels. We associate shared sleep with intimacy, with love, with commitment. But the Victorians, they saw it completely differently. To them, sharing a bed was old-fashioned. It was lower class, it was unhealthy. And most shocking of all, it was potentially fatal. So what happened? How did an entire society become convinced that married couples should sleep apart? The answer lies in three powerful forces that collided in Victorian England: medical fear, social propriety, and women's autonomy. These three threads wove together to create one of the strangest marital customs in modern history. Let us start with a real couple, George and Bertha Russell. Now, these are characters from the television show The Gilded Age, but they are based on very real people and very real customs of the 1880s. George Russell is a railroad tycoon. Bertha is his ambitious wife, determined to break into New York high society. They are madly in love. They support each other. They have built an empire together. Their marriage, by all accounts, is strong and passionate, and yet when the camera pans to their home we see it clearly. Separate bedrooms, his and hers, connected by a door, yes, but distinctly separate spaces. This was not unusual. This was not a sign of marital discord. This was simply how wealthy people lived. And the middle class, always eager to imitate their social betters, rushed to follow suit. By the 1890s, furniture catalogues were filled with advertisements for twin beds. matching beds designed to sit side by side in the same room. For those who could not afford separate bedrooms, this was the next best thing. One advertisement from 1920 boldly proclaimed, "Fine principle of a separate bed for everyone," the language is telling. A fine principle, not just a preference but a moral good. The ad continued, explaining how separate beds led to better sleep, better health, better lives. Of course, the furniture companies had a vested interest. Selling 2 beds instead of 1 meant double the profit. But they were not just making this up, they had science on their side. Or at least what passed for science at the time. Victorian doctors wrote extensively about the dangers of bed sharing. In 1861, a physician named Dr. William Whitty Hall published a book called Sleep or the Hygiene of the Night. In it, he warned that people who shared beds would fail in health and strength of limb and brain and will die before their time. He was not exaggerating for effect. He genuinely believed this, and he was far from alone. Medical journals of the era are filled with dire warnings. One writer claimed that sleeping with another person would cause injury to one or the other over time. Another suggested that the weaker sleeper would literally drain the vitality and energy from the stronger one. There were concerns that older people sleeping with younger people would siphon off their youth and vigour. This was particularly worrying when it came to older husbands and younger wives, a common arrangement in an era of strategic marriages. Now, to our modern ears, this sounds absurd, almost vampiric. And in fact, the timing is fascinating. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, right in the middle of the bed separation craze. The vampire, the creature that drains your life force while you sleep, was a perfect metaphor for Victorian anxieties about intimacy, about bodies, about the dangers lurking in the dark. But here is the key. These were not fringe beliefs. These were mainstream medical opinions published in respected journals, taught in medical schools, repeated in advice books for young couples. The Victorian era was obsessed with health, with hygiene, with the idea of progress through science. And if science said separate beds were healthier, then separate beds it would be. Of course, this advice was not equally accessible to everyone. Wealth made all the difference. If you were rich, you could afford a house with multiple bedrooms. You could have his bedroom and her bedroom, each with its own dressing room, each decorated to personal taste. You could maintain the illusion of propriety while still having the option to visit each other when desired. The aristocracy had been doing this for generations. It was a mark of status, of having so much space you did not need to share it. But what if you were middle class? What if you had a modest home with just 1 or 2 bedrooms? That is where the twin bed came in. Furniture makers saw an opportunity and seized it. They designed matching beds that could sit side by side, separated by a small nightstand. This way, a couple could share a room for propriety's sake, for economic necessity, but still maintain separate sleeping surfaces, still follow the doctor's orders, still be modern, scientific, respectable. And the working class? They continued to share beds, as they always had, because they had no other choice. But now it carried a stigma. Now it was seen as backward, as unhealthy, as lower class. The poor were not just economically disadvantaged, they were doing marriage wrong. This is what makes the Victorian separate bed phenomenon so fascinating. It reveals so much about class, about power, about who gets to define what is proper and healthy. It shows us how scientific ideas, even wrong ones, can be used to reinforce social hierarchies. And it reminds us that marriage, that most intimate of relationships, has always been shaped by forces far beyond just 2 people in love. But we have only scratched the surface. We have talked about the what and the who, we have not yet explored the why. What was the science, or rather the pseudoscience, that convinced an entire society that sleeping together was dangerous? What was the myasma theory? And why did Victorians believe so deeply in bad air? How did disease, death, and fear transform the marriage bed into a battleground? In our next part, we are going to travel even further back in time, before the separation, before the Victorian era. We are going to explore the medieval tradition of communal sleeping, where entire families, and even strangers, would pile into a single bed. We are going to see how normal it once was to share your sleeping space with multiple people. And then, we are going to watch as industrialization, privacy, and new ideas about the individual began to change everything. Because to understand why the Victorians pushed beds apart, we first need to understand when and why people started sleeping together in the first place. The story is just beginning and it gets stranger, more surprising, and more revealing with every layer we peel back. Let us rewind the clock, way back, before gas lamps and velvet curtains, before the Victorian obsession with separate beds and scientific hygiene. Let us travel to a time when the very idea of sleeping alone would have seemed not just unusual but dangerous, lonely, almost unthinkable. Picture medieval Europe, a cold stone cottage, winter wind howling outside. Inside, a single room serves as kitchen, living space and bedroom all at once. When night falls, the entire family gathers. Mother, father, children, perhaps a grandparent or two. They all climb onto one large mattress, though calling it a mattress is generous. It is more like a pile of straw covered with rough fabric, maybe some animal skins if the family is fortunate. And they sleep. Together. Bodies pressed close for warmth. Breathing in sync. Sharing that most vulnerable state of unconsciousness. Now, this might sound uncomfortable to us. Cramped. Lacking in privacy. But to them, this was normal, this was safety, this was survival. You see, for most of human history, sleeping alone was a luxury so rare that only the very wealthy or the very unfortunate experienced it. And even the wealthy often chose not to. Beds were expensive, heating was difficult, and in a world without electric lights, without alarm systems, without locks on every door, there was genuine comfort in numbers. If something went wrong in the night, a fire, an intruder, a medical emergency, you wanted people nearby. You wanted to hear their breathing. You wanted to know you were not alone. But it went beyond just the nuclear family. Here is where it gets really interesting. Travellers sharing rooms at inns would routinely sleep in the same bed with complete strangers. Yes, you read that right. You would pay for a bed at an inn, and you might wake up next to a merchant from the next town over, or a pilgrim heading to Canterbury, or a soldier passing through. This was so common that nobody thought twice about it. There was a wonderful account from a traveller named Andrew Buckley, who documented his experiences staying at various inns across England in the 1700s. He described climbing into bed after a long day of travel, only to be joined hours later by two other guests who had arrived after dark. They were strangers. They were often drunk, and yet this was simply how things worked. You shared the bed because beds were limited and expensive, and innkeepers wanted to maximize their profit. In fact, this practice became so problematic that in 1851, England passed a law making it illegal to force strangers to sleep in the same bed at boarding houses. 1851. That is just over 170 years ago. Think about that. Your great-great-great-grandparents might have lived in a world where bed sharing with strangers was still being legislated against. Now, you might be wondering, was there no sense of privacy, no sense of personal space? And the answer is not the way we understand it today. Privacy as a concept, the idea that individuals need and deserve their own separate spaces, is actually relatively modern. For centuries, privacy was not a right or even an expectation. It was something only the wealthy could afford, and even they did not always want it. Let us talk about servants for a moment. In wealthy households, female servants often slept in the same room as their mistresses, sometimes in the same bed. This served multiple purposes. The servant could attend to her mistress's needs during the night. She could help her dress and undress. She could provide companionship. And for the servant, sleeping in her mistress's room often meant access to a warmer, safer, more comfortable space than the servants' quarters. But here is something fascinating. Historians have found that this arrangement actually softened the rigid class hierarchy, at least temporarily. During the day, a servant and her mistress maintained strict social boundaries, but at night, lying in bed together in the dark, those boundaries blurred. They talked, they shared confidences, they became, in a sense, more equal. The bed became a neutral territory where the normal rules of society did not quite apply. The historian Roger Ekirk, who has written extensively about sleep in pre-industrial times, describes these moments beautifully. He writes that lying in bed in the dark encouraged wives to express concerns unsuited to other hours, gave servants opportunities to speak more freely, and allowed siblings to whisper secrets they would never share in daylight. The bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a place where social masks could slip, where hierarchies could temporarily dissolve, where humans could connect beyond their prescribed roles. And let us not pretend everything was innocent and proper. Bed sharing had other dimensions too. Male servants who shared beds sometimes engaged in sexual relationships. When male and female servants became bedmates, which happened more often than official records like to admit, illegitimate pregnancies were a predictable result. The bed was a space of transgression, of possibility, of human desire breaking through social constraints. For married couples, the shared bed held particular significance. Away from the prying eyes of servants and family members during waking hours, the marriage bed at night became a place of genuine intimacy. Not just physical intimacy, though, certainly that, but also emotional intimacy, conversation, negotiation. Ekirk's research suggests that for many women, the bed was one of the few places they had any real autonomy within the patriarchal household. Sexual boundaries were redrawn in the dark. Women could say no. They could initiate. They could express needs and desires that were unacceptable to voice in daylight. So we have this rich, complex tradition of communal sleeping that stretches back through all of human history. Families together, strangers together, masters and servants together. It is warm, it is practical, it is social. It is intimate in ways both beautiful and complicated. And then something changed. Actually, many things changed, all at once. The Industrial Revolution transformed where people lived and how they worked. Suddenly there were factories. Cities grew explosively. A new middle class emerged. People who were not wealthy aristocrats but were not poor labourers either. They had money to spend. They had aspirations. They wanted to be respectable, and they were hungry for ways to distinguish themselves from the lower classes they had recently escaped. This middle class built new kinds of houses, not grand estates, but not cramped cottages either. Modest homes with multiple rooms, a parlour for receiving guests, a dining room, and crucially, separate bedrooms. The Victorian home, as it developed through the 1800s, became a maze of specialised spaces. Each room had its purpose. Each person had their place. This shift toward privacy had been slowly building for 2 centuries, but it accelerated rapidly in Victorian times. The home became divided into separate spheres, upstairs for the family, downstairs for the servants, men's spaces and women's spaces, public rooms and private rooms. And bedrooms, those most intimate of spaces, were carved up further still. First, children got their own rooms, separate from their parents. Then in wealthy families, husbands and wives began to separate as well. But why? If communal sleeping had worked for thousands of years, if it had served practical and emotional purposes, if it was normal and natural and expected, why did the Victorians reject it so thoroughly? Part of the answer is about status. Remember, the aristocracy had always had separate bedrooms when they could afford them. It was a mark of wealth, of having more space than you actually needed. The rising middle class wanted to emulate this. They wanted to signal their success, their respectability, their distance from the crowded, shared sleeping arrangements of the poor. But there is a deeper answer too. The Victorians were not just separating physically, they were separating philosophically. They were developing new ideas about individuality, about personal boundaries, about the importance of being separate, distinct, autonomous persons. The Enlightenment had planted these seeds, Romanticism watered them, and by the Victorian era the idea of the individual, separate, private, self-contained, had become central to how people understood themselves. And then, on top of all this cultural and philosophical change, came the science, or rather, what the Victorians believed was science. By the mid-1800s, doctors and public health officials were becoming increasingly concerned about disease. Cholera epidemics swept through London, tuberculosis was rampant, infant mortality was horrifyingly high. People were dying and nobody understood exactly why. This was before germ theory, remember. Bacteria and viruses had not been discovered yet. So doctors looked for other explanations, and they found one: bad air, myasma, the belief that diseases were caused by foul-smelling vapours rising from decomposing matter, from sewage, from crowded, unwashed bodies. If you could smell something bad, the theory went, you were breathing in disease, and if you were breathing in disease, you would get sick. Now, imagine you are a Victorian doctor, and you're thinking about all these people sleeping together, all those bodies, all that breathing, all that exhaling and inhaling back and forth, sharing the same air all night long. To a believer in miasma theory, this sounds incredibly dangerous. You are literally marinating in each other's exhalations. You're breathing disease directly into your lungs, hour after hour, night after night. Suddenly, the ancient practice of communal sleeping looks not cozy, but deadly. Not intimate, but infectious. Not normal, but negligent. And so the advice changed. Medical books started warning against bed sharing. Public health campaigns promoted separate sleeping. Furniture makers saw an opportunity and started marketing beds as health equipment. The message spread through sermons, through magazines, through advice books for young brides. Sleeping together is old-fashioned. Sleeping separately is modern, scientific, proper, and above all healthy. The communal bed, that ancient space of warmth, intimacy, and connection, was being transformed in the Victorian imagination into a vector of disease. What had sustained humanity for millennia was now seen as a threat to survival itself. But here is the twist. As we are about to discover, the science behind this transformation was spectacularly, tragically wrong. The miasma theory that convinced Victorians to separate their beds was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how disease actually works. And yet this flawed science would reshape marriage, architecture, and intimate life for nearly a century. In our next section, we are going to dive deep into the miasma theory itself, what it claimed, why people believed it so passionately, and how it led to some truly bizarre medical advice about sleeping arrangements. We are going to meet the doctors and public health crusaders who spread this message. We are going to explore the deadly cholera epidemics that seem to prove them right. And we are going to see how sometimes being wrong can still accidentally lead to positive changes, even as it causes harm in other ways. The story of the Victorian bedroom is just getting started, and the science behind it is about to get very, very strange. So what exactly did Victorian doctors believe? What was this myasma theory that convinced an entire civilization to reorganize their most intimate spaces? To understand how profoundly wrong and yet how powerfully influential this idea was, we need to go back to its origins. The concept of miasma is ancient. The word itself comes from ancient Greek, meaning pollution or defilement. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, proposed it back in the 5th century before Christ. He believed that diseases arose from environmental factors, bad water, foul air, improper diet. This made intuitive sense. After all, people could see and smell the connection between filth and sickness. Cities with open sewers smelled terrible, and people in those cities got sick more often. Swamps produced a distinctly unpleasant odour, and people who lived near swamps seemed to suffer from mysterious fevers. The correlation seemed obvious, but correlation, as we know now, is not causation. The Victorians, however, did not know this. To them, if something smelled bad, it was literally killing you. The smell itself was the disease. Let me paint you a picture of Victorian London in the summer of 1858. This event became known as the Great Stink, and it was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The city had been growing explosively. By the mid-1800s, over 2 million people were crammed into London, and the Thames River had become essentially an open sewer. Every home, every business, every factory dumped waste directly into the river. And in the hot summer of 1858, the Thames essentially stopped flowing. The water level dropped, the sewage concentrated, and the smell became so overpowering that it brought the city to its knees. Members of Parliament could not meet in the Houses of Parliament because the stench from the river was so unbearable. They soaked the curtains in chloride of lime, trying to mask the smell. It did not work. They considered relocating the government entirely. Londoners walked through the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Some wore primitive masks soaked in perfume or vinegar. The city was convinced that at any moment, this foul air would trigger a massive epidemic that would kill thousands. Here is the fascinating part. The Great Stink did not actually cause a major disease outbreak, but nobody knew why. To believers in miasma theory, this should have been catastrophic. The air was clearly poisonous. You could smell it. And yet people were not dropping dead in the streets. This should have raised questions about the theory. Instead, it made believers double down. They concluded that they had simply been lucky, or that their preventative measures, those vinegar-soaked masks, those lime-treated curtains, had saved them. One of the most influential voices promoting miasma theory was a man named Edwin Chadwick. Now, Chadwick was not a doctor. He was a social reformer, a lawyer, a bureaucrat. But in 1842 he published a report that would change public health in Britain forever. Report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain. This report was a sensation. It documented in horrifying detail the living conditions of the poor, the open sewers, the contaminated water, the overcrowded housing, the omnipresent filth. And Chadwick had a theory about why the poor were so sick. He believed with absolute conviction that disease was caused by bad smells. He told a parliamentary committee in 1846, and I am quoting directly here, "All smell is, if it be intense, immediate acute disease." Read that again. All smell is immediate acute disease. Not that smell might indicate the presence of something harmful, not that smell correlates with unsanitary conditions. No, the smell itself is the disease. This was not a fringe opinion. This was mainstream medical thinking, Doctor. Neil Arnott, a respected physician, told a royal commission in 1844 that the immediate and chief cause of many of the diseases which impair the bodily and mental health of the people, and bring a considerable proportion prematurely to the grave, is the poison of atmospheric impurity arising from the accumulation in and around their dwellings of the decomposing remnants of the substances used for food, and from the impurities given out from their own bodies. Think about what he is saying. The air around your body, the air you exhale, contains impurities that can poison others. Your breath, your sweat, the invisible emanations from your skin, all of these were believed to corrupt the air around you. And if you slept in a closed room with another person, you were essentially steeping in their poisonous exhalations all night long. Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse, was a passionate believer in miasma theory. She wrote in her influential book Notes on Nursing that the very first rule of nursing was to keep the air he breathes as pure as the external air without chilling him. She believed that diseases like scarlet fever, measles, and smallpox were caused by bad air escaping from drains built beneath houses. She advocated obsessively for ventilation, for open windows, for the constant circulation of fresh air. Now, here is the irony. Nightingale was wrong about miasma, but her emphasis on cleanliness, on sanitation, on fresh air and sunlight, these things actually did improve health. Not because they eliminated bad smells, but because they reduced the spread of germs that she did not believe existed. She was right for the wrong reasons. Her flawed theory led to genuinely helpful practices, but when it came to sleeping arrangements, miasma theory led to some truly bizarre recommendations. Dr. William Whitty Hall, whom we mentioned earlier, was absolutely convinced that sleeping with another person would drain your vitality, but his reasoning was all about air. He believed that during sleep your body expelled poisonous vapours. If you were alone, these vapours would dissipate. But if you were next to someone else, you would breathe in their poisonous exhalations while they breathed in yours. Over time, this mutual poisoning would weaken both of you. The weaker person would suffer most because they had less vitality to begin with, and would be overwhelmed by the stronger person's more potent exhalations. This led to particularly concerning advice about children. Victorian medical books warned parents never to let children sleep together. The belief was that the weaker child would be literally poisoned by the stronger child's breath. If you had a sick child and a healthy child, keeping them in separate beds was not just about preventing contagion, it was about preventing the sick child's corrupted air from overwhelming the healthy child's system. And marriages? Well, here the advice became even more specific. Medical experts worried especially about age differences. If an older man married a younger woman, which was common, doctors warned that the older man's weakened, degenerating system would siphon off the young woman's vitality night after night. She would age prematurely. She would become weak and sickly. Her youth would literally be drained away by her husband's inferior exhalations. Can you imagine being a young Victorian bride reading this advice? Being told that sleeping next to your husband was not just uncomfortable or improper, but medically dangerous, that his very breath could poison you? Now you might be wondering, did no one question this? Did no one look around and notice that couples who shared beds were not actually dying at higher rates? And the answer is, some people did notice. Some doctors were skeptical, but the miasma believers had a powerful advantage. They had the cholera epidemics on their side. Cholera hit Britain in waves throughout the 1800s. The first outbreak arrived in 1831, and it was terrifying. Cholera was a new disease to Europeans. It had travelled from India following trade routes, and when it arrived, it killed swiftly and horribly. Victims would be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Their bodies would become dehydrated, their skin would turn blue, their eyes would sink into their skulls. It looked like something from a nightmare. Nobody understood how cholera spread. It seemed to strike randomly. One neighbourhood would be devastated while the next remained untouched. One family would lose everyone while their neighbours stayed healthy. The disease moved through cities in patterns that made no sense. To believers in miasma theory, this randomness actually made sense. Pockets of bad air, they reasoned, could form in certain areas due to local conditions: poor drainage, decomposing matter, stagnant water. If you lived in one of these pockets, you would breathe in the disease-causing miasma. If you lived just down the street where the air was clearer, you would be safe. William Farr, the government's official statistician and a friend of Florence Nightingale, described cholera as a disease mist that hovered in the air like an angel of death. This is Victorian poetry, Victorian drama, but it is also Victorian science. The image is haunting, evocative, memorable, and completely wrong. There was one man who figured out what was really happening. His name was Dr. John Snow, and in 1854 he conducted one of the most famous investigations in medical history. During a cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London, Snow meticulously mapped every case. He noticed victims all lived near a particular water pump on Broad Street. He suspected that contaminated water, not bad air, was spreading the disease. He convinced local officials to remove the handle from the pump, making it unusable. The outbreak stopped. Snow published his findings. He had evidence, he had a mechanism, he had proof that cholera was waterborne, not airborne. And yet, the medical establishment rejected his conclusions. Why? Because miasma theory was too deeply entrenched. It made too much intuitive sense. It explained too many other observations. And frankly, admitting that water, not air, was the problem would require acknowledging that decades of public health policy had been focused on the wrong thing. It was not until the 1880s and 1890s, as germ theory gradually gained acceptance, that the medical community finally abandoned miasma. But by then, the damage to sleeping arrangements was done. An entire generation had been raised to believe that sharing a bed was unhealthy. Furniture companies had built entire industries around separate beds. Architecture had been redesigned around separate sleeping spaces. Even after the science was proven wrong, the practice persisted. Because by then it was not just about medicine anymore. It was about class, about status, about modernity. It was about what it meant to be a respectable Victorian couple. The separate bed had become a symbol, and symbols are much harder to change than scientific theories. But there was another layer to this story that we have not fully explored yet. Yes, the medical fears were based on bad science, but they tapped into deeper anxieties. Victorian society was obsessed not just with disease, but with vitality, with strength, with the fear of degeneration. They believed that energy and life force were finite resources that could be depleted, transferred, stolen. This was not just about air quality. This was about power, about vulnerability, about the terrifying intimacy of sleep itself. In our next section, we're going to explore this darker dimension of Victorian bedroom anxieties, the belief that sleeping next to someone could literally drain your life force. We are going to meet the doctors who warned about vitality vampirism. We are going to see how these fears intersected with age, with gender, with power dynamics in marriage. And we're going to discover why these pseudoscientific beliefs were so much more than just medical mistakes. They reveal deep truths about Victorian fears, Victorian values, and Victorian attempts to control the uncontrollable territory of human intimacy. The story is about to get stranger still. There is something deeply primal about our fear of having our energy stolen while we sleep. Think about vampire legends. Creatures that drain your life force in the night, leaving you weak and pale by morning. These stories exist in nearly every culture, across every continent, throughout history. And in Victorian England, doctors were essentially telling people that vampires were real. except the vampires were not supernatural monsters. They were your spouse, your children, anyone who shared your bed. Welcome to one of the strangest chapters in medical history, the Victorian obsession with vitality drain. The Victorians had a particular way of thinking about human energy. They believed that each person possessed a finite amount of vital force, a kind of life energy that powered everything from physical strength to mental clarity to moral character. You were born with a certain amount, and throughout your life, you either preserved it carefully or squandered it recklessly. Hard work depleted it, illness diminished it, immorality corrupted it, and crucially, other people could siphon it away from you. This was not considered metaphorical. Victorian medical textbooks discussed vital force the way we might discuss blood sugar levels or vitamin D. It was treated as a measurable, transferable resource, and nowhere was this transfer believed to happen more readily than in the shared bed. Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson, writing in the 1880s during what we now call the Gilded Age, published a series of articles warning about the specific dangers of bed sharing. His arguments were picked up by newspapers, repeated in magazines, discussed at dinner parties. Richardson claimed that when two people slept together, their vital forces would inevitably intermingle and seek equilibrium. The person with more vitality would lose some. The person with less would gain some. But, and this is crucial, the exchange was never equal. The weaker person always benefited at the expense of the stronger. Imagine you are a healthy young woman in 1885. You've just married a man 20 years your senior, not an unusual arrangement for the time. Your husband is successful, established, but he is also older, his body showing signs of wear. According to the medical wisdom of the day, every night you spend in his bed is dangerous. His weakened system will draw on your youthful vigour. Night after night, year after year, he will unconsciously drain your vitality, leaving you prematurely aged, chronically fatigued, possibly even dead before your time. The medical journals are explicit about this. One article warns that young women married to older men face peculiar dangers from shared sleeping arrangements. Another recommends that couples with significant age differences should always maintain separate bedrooms, meeting only for conjugal purposes and then retiring to their individual spaces. But the fear went beyond just age differences. Victorian doctors believed that anyone who was sick, weak, or depleted could drain vitality from a healthier bedmate. This led to advice that sounds almost cruel by modern standards. If a child became ill, that child should immediately be isolated, not just to prevent contagion, but to protect the healthy siblings from having their strength sapped away. If a wife was recovering from childbirth, the husband should sleep elsewhere, because a weakened state would make her a kind of energy vacuum, pulling vitality from anyone nearby. There is a particularly disturbing medical text from 1872 that advises parents never to allow a nursing mother to sleep with the infant she is feeding. The logic is twisted but internally consistent. The baby is already draining the mother's vitality through breastfeeding. If the baby also sleeps next to her, it will drain even more through the exchange of breath and bodily emanations. The mother will be left utterly depleted, unable to produce sufficient milk, possibly driven to madness by exhaustion. Now we know this is nonsense. A tired new mother is tired because infant care is physically and emotionally exhausting, not because her baby is vampirically stealing her life force while they sleep. But put yourself in a Victorian mother's shoes. You're exhausted, you're overwhelmed, and a doctor, a medical professional, is telling you that your fatigue has a scientific explanation. Your baby is literally draining your vitality. Would you believe him? Many women did. The wealthy could follow this advice. They could afford separate bedrooms, separate nurseries, wet nurses to handle nighttime feedings. But what about everyone else? What about the vast majority of families who lived in 1 or 2 rooms, where separate sleeping arrangements were a physical impossibility? This is where the advice becomes not just pseudoscientific but morally troubling. Victorian medical authorities essentially told poor families, "You are damaging yourselves and your children by sleeping together. But we understand you have no choice. This is one of the many ways poverty is harmful." It turned poverty itself into a medical condition, a source of vitality depletion that the poor could not escape. But here is something I find particularly fascinating. If you look closely at Victorian medical writing about vitality drain, there is an undercurrent of something that has nothing to do with health and everything to do with power. Notice who is always described as being in danger: young wives, children, women of childbearing age, and who is described as the unintentional drainer: older men, sick people, but also implicitly husbands in general. There is a subtext here about male power and female vulnerability. The marriage bed was a place where Victorian law gave husbands almost unlimited access to their wives' bodies. Marital rape was not a legal concept. A wife could not refuse her husband. The marriage vows literally included a promise to obey. So when doctors started warning that sleeping with your husband could drain your life force, they were giving women a medical justification for something they had very few other ways to argue for: physical separation, personal space, the right to sleep alone. I am not suggesting the doctors were consciously trying to empower women. Most of them were men themselves, often deeply conservative men invested in maintaining traditional gender roles. But ideas have consequences beyond their creators' intentions, and the idea that bed sharing endangered women's health gave women a tool they could use. There are records of Victorian women writing to advice columnists, expressing their desperate need for separate sleeping arrangements. One letter, published in an 1890s women's magazine, describes a wife who is exhausted, constantly ill, unable to cope with her daily duties. She asks, could it be that sleeping next to her husband is draining her strength, as she has read in medical articles? The columnist affirms her suspicions and advises her to insist on separate beds, using her health as justification. We cannot know how many such conversations happened. We cannot know how many women used the language of vitality drain to claim space, to establish boundaries, to carve out moments of autonomy in lives that offered them very few. But the evidence suggests it was not uncommon. And then there is the fascinating case of rest cures. In the late Victorian era, a treatment became popular for women suffering from what doctors called neurasthenia, a vague diagnosis that encompassed everything from depression to anxiety to simple exhaustion. The treatment, pioneered by a doctor named Silas Weir Mitchell, involved complete isolation. The woman would be separated from her family, placed in a private room, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any stimulating activity. She would be fed rich foods and ordered to rest completely. The stated goal was to restore her depleted vital force. But look at what this treatment actually involved. Removing a woman from all her usual obligations: no husband, no children, no household duties, no social expectations, just rest, just solitude, just the chance to exist as an individual, rather than as wife, mother, daughter, servant to everyone else's needs. Charlotte Perkins. Gilman, the feminist writer, underwent this rest cure treatment in 1887 and wrote about it in her famous story The Yellow Wallpaper. She hated it. She found it infantilizing and maddening, but even she acknowledged that for some women the complete removal from domestic life, even if it was medicalized and controlled, provided a kind of relief that was otherwise impossible to obtain. Now, I want to be clear. The vitality drain theory was harmful. It was based on no scientific evidence. It caused real anxiety and fear. It led to unnecessary separations between mothers and babies, between sick children and their families, between couples who might have found comfort in physical closeness. The theory reinforced problematic ideas about weakness, about depletion, about certain people being dangerous to be near. But at the same time, it accidentally acknowledged something true. Intimacy has costs. Caring for others is energetically expensive. Being constantly available, constantly accessible, constantly on call, this does drain you. Not because of mystical vital forces, but because humans need rest, need solitude, need boundaries. The Victorians identified a real phenomenon. They just completely misunderstood the mechanism. And here is the really uncomfortable part. Some of their advice, stripped of its pseudoscientific justifications, is actually sound. Parents and children probably should not share beds long term, not because of vitality drain, but because both groups tend to sleep better with appropriate space. Couples dealing with sleep disturbances, snoring, restlessness, different schedules often do rest better apart. People recovering from serious illness often need quiet and solitude to heal. The Victorians were not entirely wrong about the what. They were just spectacularly wrong about the why. There is also something almost poignant about the Victorian obsession with vitality. They lived in a time of extraordinary change and stress. Industrialization was transforming society at breakneck speed. Cities were overcrowded and polluted. Work was becoming more regimented and exhausting. Life expectancy was still shockingly low, around 40 years on average, though that statistic is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 60s or 70s, but you would watch many friends and family members die young. Disease was everywhere, mysterious and terrifying. In that context, the feeling of being constantly drained, constantly depleted, constantly fighting to maintain your strength, that was not paranoia. That was reality. Victorian life was exhausting. And in the absence of actual scientific understanding, the vitality drain theory provided an explanation. It gave people a framework for understanding their exhaustion. It gave them strategies, however misguided, for trying to preserve their health. But it also reveals something darker about Victorian psychology. The idea that other people are dangerous. The idea that intimacy is depleting. The idea that you must protect yourself, guard your boundaries, maintain distance even from those you love most. This is not a worldview that fosters connection. This is a worldview rooted in fear. And perhaps that fear explains why the separate bed custom persisted for so long, even after the medical justifications were disproven. Fear is sticky. It lingers. Once you have been taught that closeness is dangerous, that other people can harm you simply by being near, those beliefs do not easily dissolve. They work their way into your bones, into your habits, into the architecture of your homes and the structure of your relationships. So we have reached a fascinating crossroads in our story. We have seen the medical fears, the myasma theory, the vitality drain beliefs. We have seen how these pseudoscientific ideas shaped intimate life for nearly a century. But medicine was not the only force pushing Victorian couples into separate beds. There were also the houses themselves, the actual physical spaces being built during this era. Architecture matters. Design matters. And the Victorian home was being deliberately constructed to keep people apart in ways that would have shocked earlier generations. Next, we are going to step inside the Victorian bedroom itself. We are going to explore the architecture of separation, the adjoining doors, the twin beds, the elaborate designs that made sleeping apart not just possible but expected. We're going to see how furniture makers marketed these arrangements, how interior design books advised young brides on bedroom decoration, and how even the physical spaces we inhabit shape our understanding of intimacy and marriage. The separate bedroom was not just an idea, it was a reality built in wood and fabric and stone. Walk with me through a grand Victorian mansion somewhere in London around 1885. The front door opens into a marble-floored entrance hall. A sweeping staircase leads upward. We climb it together, our footsteps muffled by thick carpet. At the top, a long hallway stretches before us, lined with doors, and here at the end of the hall we find the master suite. But notice something unusual. There is not one door, there are two. Behind the first door, his bedroom, dark wood panelling, heavy furniture, a large wardrobe filled with suits and shirts, a writing desk by the window, leather-bound books on the shelves, and in the centre a substantial bed, his bed, dressed in deep burgundy and forest green. Behind the second door, just a few feet away, her bedroom, lighter colours, floral wallpaper, a vanity table covered with silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume bottles, a chaise lounge that Victorian advice books called a long chair, where a wife could rest when overwhelmed by her duties, and her bed, distinctly separate, dressed in pastels and lace. Between these two rooms, a connecting door, sometimes locked, sometimes open, always significant. This was not a sign of marital problems. This was wealth, this was status, this was modernity itself, built into the very bones of the house. The architecture of the Victorian home tells us so much about Victorian values, and nowhere is this clearer than in the bedroom. Because the Victorians did not just theorize about separate sleeping arrangements, they constructed them. They designed homes specifically to keep married couples apart, while simultaneously creating the illusion of togetherness. Let us start with the truly wealthy, the aristocrats and the new industrial millionaires. For them, separate bedrooms were not just possible but expected. A proper country estate or city mansion would include his suite and her suite, often on opposite ends of a hallway, sometimes even on different floors. Each suite would include not just a bedroom but also a dressing room, sometimes a private bathroom, occasionally even a small sitting room. The English architect Robert Kerr published an influential book in 1864 called The Gentleman's House, which became the Bible of domestic architecture for the wealthy. Kerr laid out precise rules for bedroom arrangement. The master and mistress should have separate apartments, he wrote, except among the half-civilized or poor. Notice that language, half-civilized. Sharing a bedroom was not just lower class, it was barbaric. It was what savage peoples did. Civilized, refined, modern people required separate spaces, but Kerr was not inventing this idea. He was codifying practices that had existed among the aristocracy for generations. If you look at great houses from earlier periods, Elizabethan manor homes, Georgian estates, you find the same pattern. The lord and lady had separate chambers. What changed in the Victorian era was not the practice among the wealthy, but the aspiration of the middle class to imitate it. Because here is the thing about the Victorian middle class. They desperately wanted to appear wealthy even when they were not. A successful merchant or lawyer or doctor might be able to afford a nice townhouse, but not a mansion with endless rooms, so architects and builders had to get creative. How do you give a middle-class couple the status symbol of separate bedrooms without the actual space for separate bedrooms? The answer was ingenious. Twin beds. Picture a middle-class bedroom around 1890. Not as large as the aristocratic suites we described earlier, but respectable, well furnished. And in the centre of the room, instead of one double bed, there are two matching beds, identical frames, identical mattress, identical coverlets. They sit side by side, perhaps with a small nightstand between them. Close enough to talk to each other before sleep, close enough to maintain the appearance of sharing a room, but separate, distinctly, deliberately separate. This arrangement satisfied multiple needs simultaneously. It followed medical advice about air circulation and vitality preservation. It signalled that the couple was modern and scientifically informed. And crucially, it was affordable. You did not need a mansion to have twin beds. You just needed a slightly larger bedroom and the money to buy 2 beds instead of 1. And furniture makers were more than happy to sell you those beds. Oh, the marketing campaigns that surrounded twin beds in the late 1800s and early 1900s are a masterclass in creating demand where none previously existed. Furniture catalogues from the 1890s onward are filled with glossy advertisements showing matching twin beds in elegant settings. The beds are always pristine, the rooms are always spacious and airy, and the text promises everything from better sleep to better health to a more modern, sophisticated lifestyle. One catalogue from 1898 shows an illustration titled "Different Types of Beds for the Modern Home." The twin bed arrangement is presented as the height of fashion and good sense. Another advertisement from 1905 features a wealthy-looking couple in separate beds, with text proclaiming, "The scientific bed arrangement, each sleeper independent and undisturbed." Notice that word, independent. In an era obsessed with individuality, with personal autonomy, with the rights and dignity of the individual person, twin beds were marketed as a declaration of independence within marriage. But the marketing went deeper than just selling furniture. It was selling a world view. It was selling the idea that modern people were different from their grandparents, that science had progressed, that we now knew better than the ignorant past. One particularly revealing advertisement from 1910 shows an old-fashioned double bed labelled "The Old Way," next to pristine twin beds labelled "The Modern Way." The message is clear. If you want to be modern, sophisticated and forward-thinking, you sleep separately. Now you might be wondering, how much did this cost? Were twin beds actually affordable for the middle class? Or was this just aspirational marketing aimed at people who could never actually buy the product? The answer varies, of course, but here is what we know. In 1890s England, a good quality iron bedstead, the frame, might cost anywhere from £1 to £3. Complete set of bedding, mattress, sheets, blankets, coverlet might add another £2 to £4. So equipping a bedroom with twin beds, you are looking at roughly £10 to £14 total, compared to perhaps £5 to £7 for a single double bed. For context, a skilled tradesman in the 1890s might earn about £2 per week, so twin beds represented several weeks of wages, a significant expense but not impossible. It was the kind of purchase a middle-class family might save for, might budget for, might consider a worthwhile investment in their health and social standing. And the furniture makers knew this. They offered payment plans, they advertised sales, they created lower-cost versions of their premium designs. They did everything possible to make twin beds accessible to as many people as possible, because every couple that bought twin beds was a couple that bought 2 beds instead of 1. The profit motive here was undeniable. But let us return to those grand homes with separate bedrooms, because there is a fascinating detail that tells us so much about how these arrangements actually worked. Remember that connecting door between his bedroom and her bedroom? That door had an interesting role in Victorian marital life. During the day, it might remain closed, giving each partner complete privacy for dressing, resting, or personal activities. But at night, it could be opened. A husband could knock, could visit his wife's room for conjugal purposes, and then return to his own bed for sleep. Or sometimes, on special occasions or by mutual desire, the couple might choose to sleep together in one room or the other. The key word here is choice, or at least the appearance of choice. The separate bedrooms created a structure where intimacy became something that required a decision, a movement, a crossing of a threshold. It was no longer the default state that happened simply because you both fell asleep in the same place. It became intentional. Now, we need to talk about the reality behind this arrangement, particularly for women. Because in theory, having a separate bedroom sounds empowering, your own space and your own bed, the ability to lock your door if you wish, but remember the legal context. A married woman in Victorian England had almost no legal rights. Her husband owned her property, he controlled her money, and crucially, she could not legally refuse him sexual access. Marital rape was not a crime. It was not even a concept in law. So that connecting door, it could be locked from inside, yes, but if a husband knocked and his wife did not open it, he had legal and social authority to demand entry. The separate bedroom gave the appearance of autonomy while preserving male authority. And yet, and this is important, appearances matter. Structures matter. The mere fact of having to knock, having to cross a threshold, having to request rather than simply expect. This introduced a pause, a moment of consideration, a space where perhaps a conversation could happen, where a tired wife might say, "Not tonight, I have a headache," and use the excuse of illness that Victorian medical theory had helpfully provided her. There are hints in Victorian letters and diaries that some women did use their separate bedrooms strategically. Not often, not openly, but the space existed. And some women claimed it. One diary entry from 1887, written by a middle-class wife, mentions that she has retired to my own room with a sick headache, and notes with satisfaction that she was not disturbed. The subtext is clear. We also need to talk about what happened during house parties, because this reveals another fascinating aspect of Victorian bedroom culture. When wealthy families hosted guests for extended stays, which was common, especially at country estates, bedroom arrangements became quite complex. Married couples visiting together would typically be given separate bedrooms, just as they had at home, but the house would be full of other guests as well, all in their own separate rooms. And here is where it gets interesting. The housekeeper would place small cards on each bedroom door, identifying whose room it was. This was officially to help guests find their way in an unfamiliar house. But it served another purpose as well. In the middle of the night, it was not uncommon for guests to engage in what was delicately called corridor creeping. Married men visiting married women who were not their wives. Unmarried couples seeking secret assignations. Affairs, liaisons, romantic entanglements, all facilitated by the fact that everyone had their own room with a door that could be quietly opened and closed. The name cards ensured that if you were going to creep down the corridor in the dark, you at least ended up at the right door. Getting caught was scandalous, but accidentally entering the wrong room, that would be absolutely mortifying for everyone involved. This practice was so well known that it became a kind of open secret. Everybody knew it happened. Hostesses knew it happened. They arranged rooms accordingly, placing certain guests near each other, placing others strategically far apart. There were even semi-formal rules. Affairs were acceptable as long as you were discreet, as long as you did not create a scene, as long as the wife had already produced an heir or two, securing the family line. Does this sound wildly hypocritical given the Victorian era's reputation for moral strictness and sexual repression? Yes, absolutely yes, and that is precisely the point. The separate bedroom culture allowed Victorians to maintain a public facade of propriety while engaging in private behaviour that completely contradicted it. The architecture enabled this doubleness. But let us shift perspective again. What about the aspiring middle class who could not quite afford twin beds? What about the working class families in cramped apartments? They were reading the same advice books, they were hearing the same medical recommendations, They knew that proper, modern, scientific people slept separately, but they could not afford to follow the advice. This created a fascinating market for cheaper alternatives. Furniture catalogues began offering folding screens that could be placed between two sides of a double bed, creating a visual and psychological division, even if the couple was technically still sleeping on the same mattress. Some catalogues sold special long bolsters, essentially long pillows, that could be placed down the centre of the bed as a divider. One particularly creative catalogue from 1903 advertised something called the Modesty Screen, a lightweight wooden frame with fabric panels that attached to the headboard and footboard of a standard double bed, essentially creating a wall down the middle. The advertisement promised all the benefits of separate beds, independent air circulation, freedom from disturbance, at a fraction of the cost. Can you imagine sleeping like that, with a screen down the middle of your bed? It sounds absurd, it sounds uncomfortable. It sounds like a recipe for marital discord rather than marital harmony. And yet people bought these products. They wanted to follow the medical advice. They wanted to appear modern. They wanted to do right by their health, even if they could not afford the ideal solution. What strikes me most about all of this, the separate suites, the twin beds, the folding screens, is how much effort Victorians put into creating physical distance between married partners. This was not accidental. This was not passive. This required planning, expense, construction, and constant maintenance of boundaries. And it reveals something profound about Victorian anxiety. They were so convinced that closeness was dangerous, medically, morally, socially, that they rebuilt their homes to prevent it. They turned intimacy into something that required effort rather than something that happened naturally. They made separation the default and togetherness the exception. But we have been focusing on the physical spaces and the furniture. We have not yet fully explored the human side of all this. What did it actually feel like to be a Victorian woman in this system? What kind of autonomy did these separate sleeping arrangements actually provide? How did the emerging women's movement of the late 1800s intersect with bedroom politics? Because while doctors and architects and furniture makers were redesigning Victorian bedrooms, Victorian women themselves were starting to demand changes. They were starting to claim rights. They were starting to push back against the systems that confined them. And the bedroom, that most intimate of spaces, became a surprisingly important battleground in the fight for women's autonomy. The new woman was coming, and she had some very specific ideas about where and how she wanted to sleep. She was riding a bicycle, wearing bloomers, reading controversial books, attending university lectures, refusing to marry. And when she did marry, she demanded her own bedroom, not because a doctor told her to, but because she wanted it. Meet the new woman, capital N, capital W, the Victorian era's most controversial figure. The term itself was coined in 1894 by a writer named Sarah Grand in an article that sent shockwaves through polite society. Grand described a new type of woman emerging in late Victorian England, educated, independent, unwilling to accept the traditional limitations placed on her sex. This woman did not want to be merely an angel in the house, the submissive, self-sacrificing ideal that poet Coventry Patmore had celebrated decades earlier. She wanted more. She wanted autonomy. She wanted a voice. She wanted control over her own life, her own body, her own bedroom. And here is what makes this so fascinating in the context of our story. The separate bedroom, which had been imposed on Victorian women by male doctors and male architects, was now being claimed by women themselves, but for entirely different reasons. Let me take you back to 1888. A woman named Mona Caird published an essay in the Westminster Review titled simply Marriage. In it, she did something shocking. She criticised marriage as an institution, not specific bad marriages, but marriage itself. She called it a system that enforced male dominance and female submission. She described how marriage law gave husbands total control over their wives' bodies, property, and choices. And she argued that true reform would require fundamental changes to how couples related to each other, including, specifically, how they shared space. The response was explosive. The essay generated over 27,000 letters to newspapers and magazines. Some people agreed passionately, many more were horrified, but nobody could ignore it. Caird had touched a nerve. She had said aloud what many women had been thinking privately, that Victorian marriage was suffocating, that the bonds of holy matrimony felt more like chains than blessings. The following year, Caird published a novel called The Wing of Azrael, which dealt with marital cruelty and what we would now call marital rape. It was scandalous, it was controversial, and it was widely read, particularly by women who saw their own experiences reflected in its pages. But Caird was not alone. The late Victorian era saw an explosion of what became known as New Woman fiction, novels and essays written by and about women who challenged traditional expectations. George Egerton, whose real name was Mary Chavalita Dunn, published a collection of short stories in 1893 called Keynotes. The stories dealt frankly with female sexuality, with women's desires, with the gap between what society said women should want and what women actually wanted. One story in particular, titled Across This Line, features a married woman lying in bed at night, pretending to be asleep while her husband reads beside her. She is thinking about her life, her choices, her secret desires, and she realizes that marriage has required her to hide her true self, to perform a role, to be someone she is not. The bedroom, that supposedly intimate space, has become a stage where she must constantly act. This was radical stuff. Victorian propriety demanded that such thoughts remain unspoken, that women maintain the fiction that they were perfectly content with their prescribed roles. But the New Woman writers were breaking that silence. They were saying, we are not content, we want more, we deserve more. And one of the things they wanted was control over their own sleeping arrangements. Professor Hilary Hines, a modern scholar who has studied this period extensively, makes a brilliant observation in her research on twin beds and marriage. She notes that twin beds are visually equal to each other, they take up the same amount of space. This might seem obvious, but think about what it means. In a traditional double bed, there is no clear division. The bed is shared space, and in Victorian law and culture, shared space in marriage belonged to the husband. But twin beds, they create a visual and spatial equality. His bed and her bed, his space and her space. Equal claim, equal territory. Hines goes on to explain, there is a kind of pause between one bed and the other. There would have to be some conscious negotiation, or at least some conscious decision to move from one to the other. Do you see what this means? In a shared bed, intimacy is the default. To refuse intimacy requires saying no, requires an active rejection. But with twin beds, intimacy requires active choice, requires someone to get up, to cross the space to ask permission. For Victorian women with no legal right to refuse their husbands, this pause mattered. This space mattered. It was not much. It was not legal protection. But it was something. It introduced the possibility of negotiation into an arrangement that legally allowed for none. One woman writer, whose diary was later studied by historians, described her twin bed arrangement with obvious satisfaction. She wrote in 1896, "We have modern beds now, side by side but separate, and I find I sleep much better. More importantly, I have moments to myself, in my own bed, where I might read or think before sleep comes. It is a small freedom, but freedom nonetheless." A small freedom, that phrase captures so much. The new woman was not asking for revolution overnight. She was claiming small freedoms wherever she could find them. The right to education, the right to work, the right to own property after the married women's property. Acts of 1870 and 1882 finally gave married women some legal standing. And yes, the right to her own bed, but we need to be careful not to romanticize this too much. The separate bedroom movement was complicated. Yes, some women used it to claim autonomy, but it was still rooted in medical pseudoscience that portrayed women as weak, as vulnerable, as needing protection from the very men they married. The language of vitality drain and health preservation reinforced ideas about female fragility, even as it gave women tools to protect themselves. And here is another uncomfortable truth. Not all women wanted separate beds. Many Victorian women found comfort in physical closeness with their husbands. Many had loving, respectful marriages where the shared bed was a source of intimacy and connection, not oppression. The New Woman rhetoric sometimes presented all Victorian marriages as sites of suffering, but reality was more nuanced. There is a fascinating debate that played out in women's magazines in the 1890s. One side argued that separate beds were essential for women's health and dignity. The other side argued that separate beds would damage marital intimacy and ultimately harm women by weakening the emotional bonds that gave them whatever influence they had within marriage. Both sides claimed to be advocating for women's well-being. Both sides had points worth considering. But let us talk about the women who embraced the New Woman identity most fully. These were often educated women, sometimes from wealthy families, who had the resources and social position to challenge conventions. They attended the new women's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford, though Oxford did not grant degrees to women until 1920, and Cambridge waited until 1948. They participated in suffrage movements demanding the right to vote. They entered professions previously closed to women. They wrote, they spoke, they organized, and many of them chose not to marry at all. Here is a statistic that shocked Victorian society. By 1872, there were approximately 1,248,000 unmarried women between the ages of 20 and 40 in England and Wales. This was out of a total female population in that age range of less than 3 million. Nearly half of women of marriageable age were unmarried. Some were widows, some hoped to marry eventually. But a growing number were choosing to remain single. One male writer, William Rathbone Gregg, published an essay in 1872 titled, "Why Are Women Redundant?" He was genuinely concerned, or at least claimed to be, about what would happen to all these unmarried women. His proposed solution was bizarre. Ship them to British colonies where men outnumbered women and they could find husbands. He calculated it would require 10,000 ship voyages to transport them all. The essay is patronizing and absurd, but it reveals Victorian anxiety about women who refuse to fulfill their expected role. But from the perspective of many of these redundant women, remaining single was not a problem. It was a choice. It was freedom. Marriage meant losing legal identity. It meant subordination to a husband. It meant constant pregnancy and the serious risk of death in childbirth. It meant giving up any career or intellectual pursuits. For women who wanted to write, to teach, to engage in social reform work, to live independently, remaining unmarried was often the only option. Some of these women formed what historians call Boston marriages, long-term cohabiting relationships between two women. Whether these were romantic relationships, practical partnerships, or deep friendships is often unclear from historical records, and probably varied from case to case. But what is clear is that many women found ways to create households and lives that did not require a husband. Frances Power Cobbe was one such woman. Born in 1822, she became a prominent journalist, social reformer, and advocate for women's rights. She never married, Instead, she lived for many years with a sculptor named Mary Lloyd, whom she called my friend in public, but to whom she was clearly deeply devoted. When Lloyd died in 1896, Cobb was devastated. She described Lloyd as the most important person in her life, more important than any family member, more important than any other friend. In her autobiography, published in 1894, Cobb wrote openly about her inability to love men as other women did. This phrasing, which appears in other women's writings of the era as well, suggests that at least some Victorian women recognized in themselves desires that did not fit the heterosexual marriage script that society demanded. But whether these new women were in relationships with other women, remained contentedly single, or entered marriages on their own terms, they shared a common insistence. Women were autonomous persons with rights to self-determination, including the right to determine where and how they slept. The opposition to this movement was fierce. Clergymen preached sermons warning that the new woman would destroy the family, destroy marriage, destroy society itself. Medical journals published articles suggesting that educated women were more likely to be infertile or to have difficult childbirths, the implication being that education itself was unfeminine and would damage a woman's reproductive capacity. Political cartoons mocked new women as masculine, unattractive, bitter. When the twin bed controversy reached its peak in the 1890s, conservative voices explicitly linked separate beds to the New Woman movement and condemned both. One clergyman wrote that twin beds represented a dangerous rejection of wifely duty and an embrace of selfish individualism that threatens the sacred bonds of marriage. Another warned that separate beds would lead to separate lives, separate hearts, and ultimately divorce. But here is the twist. While conservatives were panicking about twin beds destroying marriage, manufacturers and advertisers were successfully selling twin beds to the middle class as a symbol of modern, scientific, respectable marriage. The same arrangement was simultaneously being marketed as both dangerously radical and reassuringly proper, depending on who was doing the talking. This contradiction reveals something important about the Victorian era. It was a time of tremendous anxiety and rapid change. Women were demanding rights. Science was upending old certainties. Social structures were shifting, and people were trying to make sense of it all, often ending up with contradictory positions depending on which fear was dominant at any given moment. The new woman scared people because she represented change, fundamental change, not just in politics or law, but in the most intimate aspects of life, in marriage, in family, in the bedroom itself. If women could claim autonomy in the bedroom, what else might they claim? Where would it end? Of course, from our modern perspective, we know where it ended, or rather, where it is still going, because the fight for gender equality continues. But the Victorian New Woman was a crucial moment in that long struggle. She demonstrated that women could think for themselves, could make their own choices, could refuse to accept limitations that society presented as natural and inevitable. And the bedroom, that seemingly private, political space, was part of the battleground. When a Victorian woman insisted on her own bed, she was not just following medical advice, she was making a statement. She was claiming space. She was asserting that her needs, her comfort, her autonomy mattered. But here is something we have not fully addressed yet. The men in all of this. We have talked about male doctors, male architects, male lawmakers, but what about husbands themselves? What did Victorian men think about sleeping separately from their wives? How did they respond to women's demands for bedroom autonomy? Were they threatened, relieved, indifferent? And perhaps most intriguingly, how did the separate bedroom culture intersect with the sexual double standard that gave men freedoms their wives could never have? Because while Victorian women were fighting for small freedoms like their own beds, Victorian men were navigating an entirely different set of expectations and privileges. The story of separate beds is not complete until we understand the male side of this arrangement, the advantages it gave them, the constraints it imposed, and the ways some men used bedroom geography to maintain power, while others found unexpected liberation in sleeping apart. Imagine being a Victorian gentleman. You've married a respectable woman from a good family. You maintain a proper household, you attend church on Sunday, you present yourself to the world as a model of moral rectitude, and at night you retire to your own bedroom, close the door, and sleep alone. But here is what nobody talks about. Where did you spend the evening before retiring? Who else might have their own separate bedroom in another part of town? What freedoms did that separate sleeping arrangement actually afford you? Because while we have explored what separate bedrooms meant for Victorian women, we have barely scratched the surface of what they meant for Victorian men. And the answer is complicated, revealing, and deeply unfair. Let us start with the official story. Victorian advice books for men presented separate sleeping arrangements as a health measure and a sign of respect for their wives. One popular marriage manual from 1886, written by a doctor named George Nafis, advised newlywed husbands that a gentleman will not impose his presence upon his wife when she requires rest and solitude. The language here is telling. The husband's presence is something imposed. The wife needs protection from it, even in marriage. Another advice book published in 1883 entitled Our Manners and Social Custom told men, the burden, or rather the privilege, of making home happy is not the wife's alone. There is something demanded of the lord and master, and if he fails in his part, domestic misery must follow. Notice that phrase, lord and master. Even in a book advocating for husbands to be considerate, male authority is taken as given. So the official message to Victorian men was, be civilized, be considerate, give your wife her own space. This will make you a modern, enlightened husband rather than a brutish one. But scratch beneath that surface and you find something else entirely. Because separate bedrooms for men meant freedom. Freedom to come and go without explanation. Freedom to stay out late without disturbing anyone. Freedom to pursue activities that wives were not supposed to know about. Victorian England had a flourishing culture of gentlemen's clubs. These were private establishments, exclusive, expensive, members only, where men could gather away from the scrutiny of wives and families. The Reform Club, the Athenaeum, White's, Brooks's. These clubs had dining rooms, libraries, smoking rooms, and crucially bedrooms. A gentleman could stay overnight at his club without raising eyebrows. He might tell his wife he had business that required him to stay in town, or that he attended a meeting that ran late, or simply that he chose to sleep at his club for convenience. Whether he actually slept alone in that club bedroom, or whether he slept elsewhere entirely was his business. The Victorian sexual double standard was breathtakingly unjust. A wife was expected to be a virgin at marriage and faithful unto death. A single act of adultery could ruin her reputation, cost her custody of her children, and make her a social pariah. But a husband? Society essentially expected him to have sexual experience before marriage, and turned a blind eye to his extramarital activities as long as he was reasonably discreet. There is a chilling phrase that circulated in Victorian society. A man may have his adventures, but a woman must be above reproach. The implication was clear. Men were allowed to stray. Women were not, and separate sleeping arrangements facilitated this double standard beautifully. If a husband returned home late, he went to his own bedroom. He did not have to wake his wife, did not have to explain where he had been, did not have to account for the smell of cigar smoke or perfume that was not hers. The separate bedroom was an alibi, a buffer, a way to maintain the appearance of respectable marriage while living a life that might be anything but. But let us not make this too simplistic. Not all Victorian men were conducting affairs or visiting brothels. Many were genuinely faithful husbands who valued the separate bedroom arrangement for more innocent reasons. They worked long hours, they came home exhausted, they appreciated having a quiet space to rest without worrying about disturbing their wives. They liked having a room that could be furnished to their tastes, that could serve as a private study or dressing room. There is a touching letter from 1891 preserved in a collection of Victorian correspondence, where a middle-aged husband writes to his adult daughter about his marriage. He describes how he and his wife have maintained our own chambers these 20 years, and I believe it has preserved our affection. He explains that after a long day he sometimes needs solitude to settle his mind, that his wife, who rises early, needs uninterrupted rest, that they meet for breakfast each morning, refreshed and pleased to see one another rather than irritable from mutual disturbance in the night. This is a man who genuinely believes that sleeping apart has strengthened his marriage, and perhaps for him and his wife it has. Perhaps they have found a rhythm that works for them. Perhaps their separate bedrooms reflect mutual respect rather than distance or infidelity. But here is the crucial difference. This was his choice, his preference, his comfort that was being prioritized. Because even in the most equitable Victorian marriages, even when both partners agreed to separate bedrooms, the power dynamics were fundamentally unbalanced. Consider the legal realities. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a wife's money legally belonged to her husband. He controlled all finances. So if a couple decided to renovate their home, to create separate bedrooms, or to purchase twin beds, the husband made that decision. The wife could express an opinion, could make a request, but ultimately the money was his and the choice was his. Similarly, if a couple argued about sleeping arrangements, if a wife wanted separate beds and a husband did not, or vice versa, who had the final say? The husband. Always the husband. Victorian law gave him authority over all household decisions. He was literally by law the lord and master that the advice book referenced. So when we talk about Victorian men and separate bedrooms, we have to acknowledge this fundamental asymmetry. For men, separate bedrooms were a choice that gave them freedom, privacy, and control. For women, separate bedrooms were sometimes a hard-won concession, sometimes an imposed isolation, and always existed within a structure of male authority. Now let us talk about something that Victorian society acknowledged but rarely discussed openly: the prevalence of prostitution. London in the late 1800s had an estimated 80,000 prostitutes working in the city. That number comes from William Acton's 1857 study, Prostitution Considered in its Moral, Social and Sanitary Aspects. 80,000 in a city of roughly 2.5 million people. That is approximately one prostitute for every 30 residents, men, women and children combined. Who were these women's customers? Primarily men, married men, respectable men, men who presented themselves as pillars of society by day and sought paid sexual services by night. Victorian society dealt with this reality through a combination of denial and regulation. Officially, prostitution was a moral evil that needed to be stamped out. Unofficially, it was seen as a necessary evil that protected respectable women from male sexual demands. There was even a phrase for this twisted logic. Prostitutes were called the great social evil, but also the sewers of society. Unpleasant but necessary to carry away waste that would otherwise contaminate everything else. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in 1864, 1866 and 1869, gave police the power to arrest any woman suspected of prostitution and force her to undergo medical examination for venereal disease. If she was found to be infected, she could be detained in a hospital for up to 9 months. But notice, these laws applied only to women. The men who visited prostitutes and spread disease were not subject to examination or detention. The double standard was literally written into law, and separate sleeping arrangements played into this system. A Victorian gentleman could visit a prostitute, contract a venereal disease, and potentially avoid infecting his wife for weeks or months if they maintained separate bedrooms and limited physical contact. This was not theoretical. Medical journals of the era contain case studies of married women who contracted syphilis or gonorrhea from their husbands years into their marriages, having been entirely faithful themselves. One particularly tragic case documented in a medical journal in 1879 describes a woman who had been married for 8 years and had 3 children. She developed symptoms of advanced syphilis. She had never been unfaithful. The only possible source was her husband, who admitted, only when confronted by the doctor, that he had visited prostitutes regularly throughout their marriage and had maintained separate sleeping arrangements partially to hide any symptoms that might have developed. The wife in that case had believed the separate bedrooms were for her health and dignity. In reality, they were enabling her husband to risk her health without her knowledge. This is dark. This is difficult. But it is part of the story we have to tell. Because the separate bedroom culture was not ideologically neutral. It was not equally beneficial to both partners. It existed within and reinforced a system of profound gender inequality. But let us shift gears slightly, because not all Victorian men benefited from or supported this system. There were men who recognized its injustices and spoke against them. There were husbands who genuinely loved their wives and tried to create equitable partnerships within the constraints of Victorian society. And there were men who, for various reasons, found the separate bedroom expectation to be isolating rather than liberating. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher and political economist, married Harriet Taylor in 1851 after a long friendship. Their relationship was unusual for the time. They treated each other as intellectual equals. Mill's writings on women's rights were heavily influenced by Taylor's ideas. In his autobiography, Mill described their marriage as a partnership of minds and hearts. They did maintain separate bedrooms, as was customary in their social class, but Mill wrote that these separate spaces allowed each of them to pursue their intellectual work while still maintaining deep emotional intimacy. Another example, John Ruskin, the art critic and social thinker, had a famously disastrous marriage to Effie Gray. They maintained separate bedrooms from the start, which was normal, but Ruskin apparently took this to an extreme, avoiding physical intimacy with his wife entirely. After 6 years, the marriage was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. Effie later married the painter John Everett Millais and had 8 children with him, making clear that Ruskin's behaviour was the anomaly, not hers. The Ruskin case became a scandal, but it also revealed something. There were men who used separate bedrooms not as a cover for libertine behaviour, but as a way to avoid intimacy altogether. For some Victorian men, perhaps especially those with anxiety, religious scruples, or what we might now recognise as asexuality, the separate bedroom culture provided a way to maintain a socially acceptable marriage without the physical intimacy they did not desire. We also need to talk about the practical realities of Victorian masculinity. Men were expected to be strong, stoic, unemotional. They were not supposed to express vulnerability or need comfort. But humans need connection. Humans need intimacy. Humans need to be able to let their guard down. For some Victorian men, the bedroom was the one place they could be vulnerable, where they could admit to being tired, to being frightened, to needing comfort. And sleeping separately, always maintaining that physical distance, always preserving that emotional barrier, must have been lonely for some of them. There is a heartbreaking diary entry from a Victorian gentleman dated 1897, which surfaced in a collection published decades later. He writes, "I retired to my chamber as usual, and as I lay in the dark I could hear my wife moving about in her room adjacent. We have slept separately these 15 years, as is proper and modern, but tonight I felt a great loneliness. Is it possible to love someone and yet be so distant from them? Is this truly how marriage should be?" He does not seem to be writing about sexual frustration. He seems to be writing about emotional isolation, about the cost of always maintaining proper distance, about the loneliness of sleeping alone night after night, year after year, even when the person you love is just on the other side of a door. But could he have said this to anyone? Could he have suggested to his wife that they abandon their separate bedrooms, not without seeming unmanly, not without implying that their modern scientific arrangement was somehow insufficient? Victorian masculinity trapped men in certain ways, even as it gave them tremendous privileges. And here is perhaps the greatest irony of all: the separate bedroom system, which was supposed to be so modern and scientific and healthy, may have actually damaged many Victorian marriages. Not because sleeping together is inherently necessary for marital happiness, but because the system was imposed rather than chosen. Because it prioritized appearance over authenticity, because it prevented couples from finding their own rhythms, their own balance between closeness and independence. Some couples thrived with separate bedrooms, others suffered in silence. And the tragedy is that Victorian culture made it almost impossible to have honest conversations about what was and was not working. You were supposed to follow the rules, maintain appearances, and never admit that the modern scientific way might not actually be right for you. So where does this leave us in understanding Victorian men and separate bedrooms? It leaves us with complexity, with contradiction, with a system that gave men enormous power and privilege, while also constraining them in ways they could not always articulate, with a culture that encouraged male infidelity while also expecting men to be moral leaders of their families, with a sleeping arrangement that freed some men and isolated others, that protected some marriages and damaged others. But there is one more dimension we have not fully explored. We have talked about individual men and individual marriages. We have not yet looked at the industrial machine behind all of this, the manufacturers, the marketers, the entire economic system that made enormous profits from convincing Victorian couples that they needed to sleep apart. Because while doctors provided the medical justification and society provided the moral framework, it were business that turned separate beds into a cultural norm. It was advertising that taught people what modern marriage should look like. It was capitalism that transformed sleeping arrangements from personal choice into consumer identity. The bedroom had become a marketplace, and the marketplace was very, very good at selling separation. Follow the money. That's what they say when you want to understand why something really happens, right? So let us follow the money through Victorian England and see where it leads us. Spoiler alert, it leads straight to the bedroom furniture industry, which made an absolute fortune convincing couples that sleeping together was dangerous and sleeping apart was essential. Picture a furniture showroom in London, 1895. Gas lamps illuminate polished wood and gleaming brass. A well-dressed couple enters, newly engaged, ready to furnish their first home together. A salesman approaches, immaculately groomed, armed with catalogues and scientific-sounding facts, and he's about to sell them not one bed, but two. Modern couples, he explains smoothly, recognize the importance of healthful sleeping arrangements. Science has proven that separate beds promote better rest, reduce disease transmission, and preserve marital harmony. Why, the finest homes in England have adopted this practice. Would you not want the very best for your new life together? The couple exchanges glances. They have read about this in magazines. Their doctor may have mentioned it, and the salesman seems so confident, so authoritative. Besides, buying twin beds instead of a double bed signals that they are modern, educated people who follow scientific advice. It is not just furniture, it is an identity. The salesman closes the sale. 2 beds instead of 1. Double the profit. Now, I am not suggesting that furniture manufacturers invented the separate bed movement out of thin air. The medical theories came first, remember. The myasma beliefs, the vitality drain fears. But what furniture companies did brilliantly was take those theories and transform them into consumer demand. They turned a medical recommendation into a social necessity, and they made millions doing it. Let us look at some actual companies and their strategies. Heel & Son, one of London's premier furniture makers, began heavily marketing twin beds in their catalogue starting in the 1880s. Their 1889 catalogue is a masterpiece of persuasive advertising. It features full-page illustrations of elegant bedrooms with matching twin beds, accompanied by testimonials from satisfied customers and quotes from medical authorities. One particularly effective advertisement shows 2 images side by side. On the left, a cramped old-fashioned double bed with the caption "The unhealthful arrangement of the past." On the right, spacious twin beds in an airy room with the caption "The scientific choice of modern couples." The visual message is clear. One is backwards and dangerous, the other is progressive and safe, but Heel & Son did something even cleverer. They created different twin bed models at different price points, making the modern scientific arrangement accessible to various economic classes. Their premium sanitary twin suite cost 12 guineas, expensive but attainable for upper middle-class families. Their improved twin bedsteads in simpler iron frames cost just £4.10, bringing the modern arrangement within reach of lower middle-class households. This pricing strategy was crucial. If twin beds had remained affordable only to the wealthy, they would have stayed a niche product. But by creating options for the aspiring middle class, people desperate to signal their respectability and modernity, furniture companies tapped into a massive market. And they did not stop at just selling beds. Once you bought twin beds, you needed twin mattresses, twin sets of bedding, matching nightstands to place between them, matching lamps, perhaps matching wardrobes. The twin bed purchase was the entry point to an entire ecosystem of furniture and furnishings. It was brilliant business strategy. Maple & Company, another major Victorian furniture manufacturer, took a different approach. Their catalogues from the 1890s emphasized the aesthetic appeal of twin beds. They commissioned beautiful illustrations showing twin beds as objects of art, ornate brass frames, carved wooden headboards, luxurious fabrics. The message was not just about health but about taste, about sophistication, about creating a bedroom that looked like it belonged in a magazine. And speaking of magazines, the explosion of women's magazines in the late Victorian era gave furniture companies the perfect advertising medium. Publications like The Lady's Realm, Woman at Home, and The Queen were filled with articles about home decoration, modern living, and marital advice, and they were also filled with advertisements for furniture. These advertisements often blurred the line between editorial content and marketing. An article about the modern bedroom, a haven of rest and health, would be followed immediately by an advertisement for twin beds from a company that just happened to echo all the article's recommendations. Was the company paying for ad placement? Almost certainly. Was the article written to support the advertising? Quite possibly. Victorian readers may not have been as savvy about these relationships as we are today about sponsored content, but here is where it gets really interesting. Furniture companies did not just advertise, they sponsored medical research, they funded public health campaigns, they donated twin beds to hospitals and charitable institutions. This served multiple purposes. First, it associated their products with medical authority. Second, it created visible examples of proper sleeping arrangements that visitors would see and potentially emulate. Third, it was genuinely good publicity. They could present themselves as companies that cared about public health, not just profit. There is a fascinating case study in the archives of the Royal Free Hospital in London. In 1891, the hospital received a donation of 50 iron twin bedsteads from a manufacturer called R.W. Winfield and Company. The donation came with a brass plaque acknowledging the company's generosity. Every patient, every visitor, every medical student who passed through those wards would see Winfield beds being used in a prestigious hospital setting. The implied endorsement was powerful. If hospitals use these beds, surely they must be the healthiest choice. But did Winfield make this donation out of pure altruism? Or did they understand that it was an investment in their brand reputation that would pay dividends in increased sales? The company's profits increased by 34% in the 3 years following that donation, according to their financial records that were later archived. Correlation is not causation, but the timing is suggestive. Now, let us talk about something that might surprise you. Installment plans. Yes, Victorian buy now pay later schemes, because even with lower priced options, twin beds represented a significant expense to many families. Furniture companies recognized that if they wanted to maximize their market, they needed to make payment easier. Etzman and Company, a London furniture retailer, began offering credit terms in the 1880s. Their advertisements explicitly targeted young couples setting up their first homes. "Furnish your modern home today," one advertisement from 1887 proclaimed, "pay in comfortable monthly installments." For twin beds priced at £6, they offered terms of just 5 shillings per month, a manageable expense for a household with steady income. This financing strategy democratized access to twin beds in ways that pure cash sales never could have. Suddenly, a young clerk or shopkeeper could afford the furniture that signaled middle-class respectability, and once they committed to those monthly payments, they had a strong incentive to believe in the value of their purchase. Nobody wants to think they are making payments on something unnecessary or foolish. The psychology here is fascinating. When you buy something expensive on credit, you need to justify that purchase to yourself. You need to believe it was essential, beneficial, worth the sacrifice. So, Victorian couples making monthly payments on twin beds had a psychological investment in believing that twin beds were indeed healthier, more modern, more proper. The financial commitment reinforced the ideological commitment. But furniture companies were not the only ones profiting from separate sleeping arrangements. Textile manufacturers saw opportunities too. If twin beds required separate sets of bedding, that meant double the sheets, double the blankets, double the coverlets. Companies like Courtaulds, which manufactured fabrics, and retailers like Liberty of London, which sold finished linens, all benefited from the twin bed trend. Some textile companies even created matching bedding sets specifically designed for twin beds, coordinated but not identical, allowing couples to express individual taste while maintaining visual harmony. One catalogue from 1902 advertises his and hers bedding collections, with masculine plaids and florals for ladies available in coordinating colours. The marketing was sophisticated, appealing to Victorian ideas about gender, while making the purchase seem essential for a properly appointed home. And then there were the accessory manufacturers, companies selling bed screens, privacy curtains, bedside lamps, reading tables, all found new markets once twin beds became common. If you had separate beds, you might want separate reading lamps so one person could read while the other slept. You might want a screen to block light or create additional privacy. You might want individual tables for personal items, Each of these purchases was small, but collectively they added up to a substantial amount of consumer spending, and all of it was justified by the language of modernity, health, and scientific living. But here is something we should consider. Were furniture companies cynically exploiting baseless fears? Or were they genuinely convinced by the medical theories of their time? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Victorian businessmen lived in the same culture as everyone else. They read the same medical journals, heard the same sermons, absorbed the same beliefs about health and propriety. They probably did believe, at least to some extent, that separate beds were healthier. But they also understood that belief and profit could align beautifully. They did not need to manufacture fear from nothing. The fear already existed thanks to myasma theory and vitality drain beliefs. What they did was amplify it, reinforce it, make it impossible to ignore. Through relentless advertising, strategic donations, and clever financing, they ensured that every Victorian couple confronted the question, should we sleep together or apart? And they made sure the answer felt obvious. Let us look at some actual numbers. The UK furniture industry grew by approximately 60% between 1870 and 1900, according to economic historians who have studied manufacturing records from that period. Part of this growth came from general population increase and rising middle-class wealth. But the twin-bed market was a significant contributor. One estimate suggests that twin-bed sales accounted for roughly 25 to 30% of all bed frame sales by 1900, a massive shift from just a generation earlier when double beds dominated the market. That represents thousands of manufacturers, retailers, craftsmen and salespeople whose livelihoods depended at least partially on separate sleeping arrangements. These people had a material interest in the continuation and expansion of the twin bed trend. Not because they were villains, but because this was their business, this was how they fed their families, and this economic reality created a kind of momentum. Once so much of the industry was invested in twin beds, there was resistance to any message that might undermine demand. When germ theory began replacing miasma theory in the 1880s and 1890s, and some doctors started questioning whether separate beds were really necessary for health, furniture industry publications pushed back. They published their own articles, funded their own studies, found doctors willing to continue endorsing separate sleeping arrangements. I am not suggesting a vast conspiracy, but I am suggesting that economic incentives matter, that industries shape culture not just through direct advertising, but through the systems they build, the experts they fund, the narratives they amplify. There is a wonderful example of this in a trade publication called The Furniture Record, published in 1897. The magazine ran an editorial responding to a medical article that had questioned the necessity of twin beds. The editorial acknowledged the new germ theory, but argued that twin beds still offered benefits: better sleep due to less disturbance, more personal space, modern aesthetic appeal. Notice how the justification shifts. When the medical rationale weakened, economic actors found new reasons why their product was essential. This adaptability is key to understanding how the twin bed trend persisted, even as the science behind it collapsed. Furniture companies simply changed their marketing message. Less emphasis on disease transmission, more emphasis on comfort and independence. Less about health imperatives, more about lifestyle choices. The product stayed the same, but the sales pitch evolved. And it worked. Twin bed sales continued strong well into the early 20th century, long after miasma theory had been thoroughly debunked. Because by that point, twin beds were not just a health measure, they were a status symbol. They were what modern, sophisticated people had in their bedrooms. They were part of the cultural furniture, pun intended, of middle-class respectability. But every trend eventually faces a counter-trend. Every market eventually saturates. and the twin bed market was about to face its biggest challenge yet, not from medicine, not from social reformers, but from an unexpected source, Hollywood. Because in the 1930s, American movies were going to introduce British and European audiences to a very different kind of twin bed arrangement. One that was imposed not by doctors or furniture salesmen, but by censors. And paradoxically, this forced separation on screen would eventually help bring couples back together in real life. The story of how Hollywood's moral panic accidentally killed the twin bed industry is one of the strangest twists in this entire saga. The year is 1934, a darkened movie theatre somewhere in America. On the silver screen, Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert are about to spend the night together in a motel room. They are not married, not to each other anyway. The audience leans forward, wondering what will happen next. And then Gable does something unexpected. He hangs a blanket between the two beds in the room, creating a makeshift wall. He calls it the Walls of Jericho. The audience laughs, they understand the joke, and they're watching the beginning of an era when Hollywood would make twin beds for married couples not just acceptable but mandatory. Welcome to the Code era, when American film censors accidentally exported Victorian bedroom arrangements to millions of movie screens worldwide, freezing them in cultural amber for 3 more decades. The story begins with the scandal, actually many scandals. Hollywood in the 1920s and early 1930s was wild. Movie stars lived lavishly and behaved outrageously. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was involved in a scandal where a young actress died at one of his parties in 1921. Wallace Reid died from drug addiction in 1923. Director William Desmond Taylor was murdered under mysterious circumstances in 1922, and the investigation revealed affairs with multiple actresses. The newspapers loved it. Church groups were horrified, and pressure built for Hollywood to clean up its act. In 1930, the Motion Picture Production Code was adopted. It was written by a Catholic priest named Daniel Lord and a Catholic layman named Martin Quigley. The code laid out strict rules for what could and could not be shown in films, and buried in those rules was a requirement that would reshape how millions of people visualized marriage. Married couples in films could not be shown sharing a bed. Let me read you the actual language from the code. Scenes of passion should not be introduced when not essential to the plot. In general, passion should be so treated that these scenes do not stimulate the lower and baser element. And further, the sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. The interpretation of these rules by the Production Code Administration, the enforcement body led by a man named Joseph Breen, was that showing a married couple in the same bed was too suggestive. It implied sexuality. It stimulated lower and baser elements. So married couples in movies had to sleep in separate beds. Always, no exception. Now this is absolutely wild when you think about it. In real life, by the 1930s, American couples were increasingly sleeping together in double beds. The Victorian twin bed arrangement was starting to decline. Smaller houses built during the Depression era often had smaller bedrooms where twin beds were impractical. Cultural attitudes were shifting, but Hollywood was about to reverse that trend, at least visually, for an entire generation. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Any film that wanted to be distributed to American theaters, which meant virtually every major film made in English, had to comply with the code. And since American films dominated global markets, audiences in Britain, Canada, Australia, and beyond saw the same thing: married couples in the twin beds. Let us look at some specific examples, because they are both hilarious and revealing. I Love Lucy, the television show that began in 1951, featured Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz as Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. In real life, Ball and Arnaz were married. On screen, they played a married couple, but the couple on screen slept in twin beds pushed close together, each with their own mattress, blankets and pillows. The show aired on CBS, which followed the same censorship standards as Hollywood films. Here is what makes this particularly absurd. During the show's second season, the real-life Lucy was pregnant. The show incorporated this into the plot. Lucy Ricardo was going to have a baby, but they could not use the word pregnant on air because it was considered too explicit. They had to say Lucy was exacting. And Lucy and Ricky still had to sleep in separate beds, even though the pregnancy made it absolutely clear that they had been intimate. The audience understood the contradiction. Everyone knew that married couples slept together in real life. Everyone knew how babies were made. But television maintained the fiction of separate beds because the censors demanded it. The films of the era developed creative workarounds. Directors and actors found ways to suggest intimacy while technically complying with the rules. There was something called the 1-foot rule that emerged as an unofficial guideline. If a scene showed a man and woman on a bed together, perhaps sitting and talking, one person had to keep at least 1 foot on the floor. This somehow made it acceptable because it suggested they were not really in bed together, just temporarily sitting on one. Watch classic films from the 1940s and 1950s with this in mind, and you will see it everywhere. Romantic scenes where the couple is clearly about to kiss, but one person has a foot dangling off the bed touching the floor. It is both touching and ridiculous. Touching because filmmakers were trying to create authentic emotion within absurd constraints. Ridiculous because the constraint itself was so arbitrary. The 1940 film The Philadelphia Story, starring Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant and James Stewart, has a wonderful bedroom scene where Hepburn and Grant are discussing their relationship. They're both on a bed, but both have feet on the floor. They are leaning toward each other, clearly intimate, but the scene is staged in a way that technically complies with the code. The actors are selling the emotion while the director is managing the censors. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, who had a long-term relationship in real life and starred in multiple films together, always slept in separate beds on screen. In the 1942 film Woman of the Year, there is a scene where they are clearly meant to have spent the night together, but we see 2 beds in the morning. The implication is there, but the visual is proper. Now here is the fascinating question. Did this censorship actually change behaviour? Did seeing twin beds in every movie and television show make real couples decide to sleep separately? The evidence suggests it had some influence, yes. Television ownership exploded in the 1950s. In 1950, about 9% of American homes had a television. By 1960, that number had jumped to 87%. That is an extraordinary adoption rate. And what those televisions showed, night after night, week after week, was an idealized vision of married life where couples had separate beds. For young couples in the 1950s, setting up their first homes, watching I Love Lucy and The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, and Father Knows Best, all of which featured twin beds, this became normalized. If that is what happy, successful couples looked like on television, maybe that is what they should look like in real life too. Furniture sales data from the 1950s shows that twin bed sales remained strong, particularly in the United States, even as they were declining in Britain. Some historians have directly linked this to the prevalence of twin beds on television. People were literally furnishing their bedrooms to look like what they saw on screen. But there was pushback. Oh, was there pushback? Directors chafed at the restrictions. Actors found them absurd. And as the 1960s approached, cultural attitudes were shifting rapidly. The sexual revolution was beginning. Women were demanding equality in new ways. Young people were challenging traditional authority, and the twin bed rule began to seem not just outdated, but laughably prudish. In 1956, Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and the censors were so concerned about his hip movements being too suggestive that they filmed him only from the waist up. The audience could hear the screaming young women reacting to what they saw in person, but television viewers saw only his torso. This kind of censorship was becoming a punchline. The breakthrough came gradually. In 1964, the sitcom Bewitched premiered. Samantha and Darren Stevens, the main characters, slept in a double bed. It was still somewhat controversial, but the show was popular enough that the network and sponsors accepted it. Other shows began to follow suit. By the late 1960s, the production code itself was collapsing. Films were pushing boundaries in every direction. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 showed graphic violence. The Graduate in 1967 dealt frankly with an affair between an older woman and a young man. Midnight Cowboy in 1969 depicted prostitution and received an X rating, but was still widely distributed and even won the Academy Award for Best Picture. In this changing landscape, the twin bed requirement became impossible to enforce. In 1968, the Motion Picture Production Code was formally replaced by the MPAA rating system we still use today, G, PG, R, X, later changed to NC-17. Films could show married couples in double beds. They could show much more than that, in fact, depending on their rating. And almost overnight, twin beds disappeared from television and film. By the 1970s, seeing a married couple in a double bed on screen was completely normal. The twin bed arrangement, which had dominated Hollywood depictions of marriage for nearly 40 years, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But here is the irony. While censorship had helped keep twin beds alive in popular culture through the 1950s and early 1960s, the end of that censorship contributed to their death. Once movies and television started showing couples in double beds again, the double bed became aspirational. It became the modern choice. Twin beds started to look old-fashioned, prudish, associated with an era of repression that younger generations were rejecting. The furniture industry noticed. By the 1970s, advertisements for bedroom furniture overwhelmingly featured double beds, queen beds, and the newly popular king-size beds. Twin beds were marketed primarily for children or for guest rooms. The message was clear. If you were a modern couple, you slept together. There is a particularly telling advertisement from 1972 by Sealy, the mattress company. It shows a young couple in a large double bed with the tagline, "Together is better." The ad explicitly positions the double bed as the choice of liberated modern couples versus the separate arrangements of their parents' generation. What had once been sold as modern and scientific was now being sold as outdated and repressive. This is the power of media representation. For decades, Hollywood had frozen Victorian bedroom arrangements in place, maintaining them long after the medical justifications had disappeared. Then, when censorship ended, Hollywood helped kill those same arrangements by normalizing a different visual. But we should ask ourselves, what was lost in this shift? The twin bed arrangement, for all its problems, did offer something that many modern couples struggle to find: personal space within intimacy, the ability to sleep undisturbed, the recognition that even married partners are individuals with different needs. When we rejected twin beds completely, did we lose something valuable along with the Victorian baggage? And here is something else to consider. The Hollywood censorship era revealed something profound about how we construct reality. For 40 years, movie and television depictions of marriage had almost nothing to do with how people actually lived. Everyone knew couples slept together in real life, but on screen they always slept apart. We collectively agreed to maintain this fiction. What other fictions do we maintain? What other gaps exist between how we represent life in media and how we actually live it? Hollywood in the twin bed era was absurdly prudish by modern standards, but are we immune to similar contradictions today? Think about how social media represents relationships now. The perfect couples in perfect homes having perfect lives. How much of that is as much a fiction as Lucy and Ricky's twin beds? How much pressure does it create to live up to impossible standards? The Victorian twin bed saga, extended through Hollywood censorship well into the 20th century, is a case study in how cultural narratives get created, maintained, and finally shattered. Medical pseudoscience created the original justification. Economic incentives amplified and marketed it, and media representation normalized it for generations who had never experienced the Victorian era themselves. But every cultural narrative eventually collides with reality, and by the 1960s, reality was changing fast. The medical establishment had completely abandoned miasma theory and vitality drain beliefs. Women were demanding real equality, not just separate bedrooms. Young people were rejecting the sexual repression of their parents' generation, and the twin bed arrangement could not survive that collision. But the transition was not as simple as everyone suddenly switching back to double beds. There was a period of confusion, of negotiation, of trying to figure out what modern marriage should look like. Some couples embraced the return to shared sleeping, others found they preferred separation, and culture had to make sense of these competing preferences without the clear rules that had existed before. The great shift was coming, and it would reveal surprising truths about what couples really wanted when given the freedom to choose for themselves. Something remarkable happened in the 1950s. After nearly a century of doctors, furniture makers, and moral authorities all insisting that married couples should sleep separately, people started quietly ignoring that advice. Not loudly, not with manifestos or protests, they just started buying double beds again. And by the 1960s, the great separate bed experiment was collapsing. But why? What changed? After all, the furniture was still available. The Victorian houses with separate bedrooms still existed. The twin beds were still in catalogues. So why did couples suddenly decide to come back together? The answer lies in three converging forces. Science finally caught up with reality, women gained real power to shape marriage, and a new generation decided their parents had been wrong about almost everything. Let us start with the science. By the early 1900s, germ theory had completely replaced miasma theory in medical schools and research institutions. Louis Pasteur's work in the 1860s and 1870s had identified specific microorganisms causing specific diseases. Robert Koch had discovered the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882. The entire framework of understanding disease had shifted from bad air to germs you can see under a microscope. But here is what is fascinating. Even after germ theory was established, many doctors continued recommending separate beds. They simply changed their reasoning. Instead of saying sleeping together exposes you to bad air, they said sleeping together exposes you to germs. The recommendation stayed the same even as the justification transformed. It was not until the 1940s and 1950s that medical opinion genuinely shifted, and the shift happened because of new research on sleep itself. Scientists began studying how people actually slept, their patterns, their cycles, their needs, and what they found was surprising. Dr. Nathaniel Kleitman, often called the father of modern sleep research, published groundbreaking work in the 1930s and 1940s. His 1939 book Sleep and Wakefulness synthesized decades of research and introduced concepts like the sleep cycle and circadian rhythms. Kleitman's work established that sleep was not just rest, but a complex biological process with distinct stages. Here is what this meant for the bed-sharing debate. If sleep was a biological process, rather than simply the absence of activity, then the question became whether sharing a bed disrupted that process. And the research showed it depends. Some people sleep better with a partner, some sleep worse. It varies by individual, by relationship, by countless factors. In other words, there was no universal answer. The Victorian certainty, everyone should sleep separately for health, was replaced with scientific humility. Different things work for different people. This might sound obvious to us now, but it was revolutionary then. For a century, medical authorities had claimed to know the one correct way for everyone to sleep. Now they were essentially saying, figure out what works for you. A 1955 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association examined couples who shared beds versus those who slept separately, and found no significant health differences between the groups. The study concluded that sleeping arrangements should be based on personal preference and comfort rather than medical prescription. This was medical permission for couples to make their own choices, and most couples chose togetherness, but medical opinion alone did not drive the change. Economic factors played an enormous role. The post-World War II housing boom created a new kind of home, the suburban tract house, smaller than Victorian mansions, more affordable than city apartments, but also more compact. Levittown, the famous planned community in New York, began construction in 1947. The houses were small, about 750 square feet initially, later expanded to around 1,000 square feet. These homes had 2 or 3 bedrooms, but the bedrooms were not large. There was simply not space for elaborate twin bed arrangements with nightstands and privacy screens. If you wanted to fit 2 beds in these smaller bedrooms, they would have to be pushed right next to each other, eliminating any real separation. At that point, you might as well have a double bed. Or better yet, the newly popular queen or king-size beds that offered more space than a double, but still took up less room than 2 twins with furniture between them. The economics were clear. In the new suburban homes that millions of Americans were buying in the 1950s and 1960s, double beds simply made more sense. Form followed function, architecture shaped behavior, and the furniture industry, always responsive to market demands, adapted quickly. By the mid-1950s, advertisements for bedroom furniture had shifted dramatically. Instead of promoting twin beds as modern and scientific, they were promoting larger shared beds as romantic and intimate. Simmons, one of the major mattress manufacturers, ran a campaign in 1958 with the slogan, "Sleep together, stay together." The ads showed happy couples snuggled in double beds, with text emphasizing emotional intimacy and marital harmony. This was a complete reversal from the twin bed advertisements of just a generation earlier. The shift in advertising reveals how completely the cultural narrative had changed. Twin beds were now associated with the repressed 1950s, with old-fashioned prudery, with parents who did not understand modern life. Double beds were associated with liberation, with authenticity, with the sexual revolution that was beginning to transform society. But we should not romanticize this too much. The return to shared beds was not universally celebrated. Some people, particularly women who had valued the autonomy that separate beds provided, felt the change was a step backward. There are letters to advice columnists from the late 1950s and early 1960s where wives express ambivalence about sharing a bed again. One particularly poignant letter, published in Dear Abby in 1962, describes a woman whose husband insisted they get a double bed after 20 years of twin beds. She wrote, "I had grown accustomed to my own space, to reading as late as I wished, to spreading out when I slept. Now I feel cramped and watched. Is it wrong that I miss my twin bed?" Dear Abby's response was surprisingly progressive for the time. She wrote, "Marriage is about compromise. If you are happy with twin beds and he wants a double bed, perhaps you need to have an honest conversation about what you both need to feel comfortable and loved." This idea that couples should talk to each other about their needs rather than following cultural prescriptions was gaining ground in the 1960s. Marriage counseling was becoming more common and more accepted. Psychology was shifting from Freudian analysis to more practical approaches focused on communication and problem solving. Books like The Joy of Sex, published in 1972, presented sexuality as something couples should actively discuss and explore together. This was radically different from Victorian advice, which had treated sexuality as something that happened to women and was controlled by men. The new message was, talk to each other, figure out what works for both of you. There are no universal rules, and sleeping arrangements were part of this broader shift toward communication and negotiation in marriage. Some couples discovered they slept better together, others found they needed separate rooms, and increasingly both were seen as acceptable choices rather than one being right and the other wrong. But there was another factor driving the return to shared beds that we should not overlook. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the broader cultural changes of the 1960s all emphasized authenticity over performance. The idea was stop pretending, stop maintaining appearances, be honest about who you are and what you want. And the twin bed arrangement, especially by the 1960s, had come to symbolize pretense. It represented the gap between how people presented themselves publicly and how they actually lived. It represented Victorian hypocrisy, the men who insisted on separate beds with their wives while visiting prostitutes, the women who claimed to be delicate and fragile while running households and raising children. The counterculture of the 1960s rejected all of that. Be real, be authentic, and if you love someone and want to sleep next to them, do not let outdated propriety stop you. This message resonated powerfully with young couples. By 1970, surveys showed that over 80% of married couples under age 35 shared a bed, compared to about 60% of couples over age 55. The generational divide was stark. Younger couples embrace shared sleeping as part of a more open, honest approach to marriage. Older couples often maintained the separate arrangements they had established decades earlier. But even among older couples, change was happening. There are wonderful oral history interviews from the 1980s where elderly couples talk about their sleeping arrangements. One couple, married in 1935, describes how they started with twin beds because that was what modern people did. But in the late 1960s, after their children had grown and moved out, they bought a queen-sized bed. The wife says, "We had spent 30 years sleeping apart because we thought we were supposed to. Once we realized we could choose, we chose to be together." Another couple tells a different story. They had shared a double bed for decades but switched to separate bedrooms in their 70s when the husband developed sleep apnea and his snoring became unbearable. The wife says, "People asked if we were having problems. No, we are having better sleep, and better sleep means we are happier when we are together." These stories reveal something important. The collapse of the twin bed norm did not mean everyone rushed to double beds. It meant people had permission to make choices based on their actual needs rather than societal expectations. And here is where we see something really interesting. Sleep research in the 1970s and 1980s began documenting real issues with bed sharing. Partners with different sleep schedules, snoring, restless leg syndrome, temperature preferences, movement disturbances, all of these could genuinely impact sleep quality. So just as the culture had swung toward everyone should share a bed, science was documenting reasons why many people might sleep better apart. But this time the response was different. Instead of a new universal prescription, researchers emphasized individual variation. Instead of saying, you must sleep together, or you must sleep apart, they said, pay attention to your actual sleep quality and make decisions based on data, not ideology. This is the wisdom that was missing from the entire Victorian experiment. The Victorians had a rigid rule based on bad science. The 1960s and 1970s rejected that rule, but created a new expectation that healthy couples sleep together. And finally, by the 1980s and 1990s, we arrived at something more nuanced. There is no single right answer for everyone. But cultural change is never simple or complete. Even as medicine and psychology were saying, do what works for you, social expectations remained powerful. Couples who slept separately often felt they had to explain or justify it. There was still a stigma, still an assumption that separate sleeping meant marital problems. A 1995 survey by the National Sleep Foundation found that while 23% of American couples occasionally or regularly slept apart, 38% of those couples said they had not told friends or family about their arrangement. They were embarrassed. They feared judgment. The ghost of Victorian propriety still haunted the bedroom, just in reverse. Now the shame was attached to sleeping apart rather than together. This stigma persists today. When celebrities like Carson Daly or Gwyneth Paltrow have talked publicly about sleeping separately from their partners, the response has been fascinated curiosity mixed with barely concealed concern. Is everything okay, people ask? The assumption remains that sharing a bed is the natural, healthy norm, and yet the actual data suggests enormous variation. Recent surveys indicate that somewhere between 25 and 30% of American couples sleep apart at least some of the time. That is roughly 1 in 4 couples. This is not a fringe practice. This is a substantial minority of relationships. Why do they do it? The reasons vary. Different work schedules, snoring or sleep disorders, different temperature preferences. One partner is a restless sleeper. Children who co-sleep with one parent, medical conditions, insomnia, or simply a preference for having one's own space. And here is what is interesting. Research shows that couples who sleep separately are not less happy in their relationships than couples who sleep together. A 2018 study published in the journal Sleep Health found no correlation between sleeping arrangements and relationship satisfaction. What mattered was whether the arrangement was mutually agreed upon or a source of conflict. In other words, the Victorian doctors were wrong. Sleeping together does not drain your vitality or spread disease. But the romantic ideal that emerged afterward, that couples must sleep together to be truly intimate, is also oversimplified. Intimacy and sleep are related but not identical. You can have profound intimacy with someone and still sleep better in separate rooms. So after this long, winding journey from communal medieval beds to Victorian separation to Hollywood twin beds to modern queen-size beds, where have we ended up? In a place of hopefully greater wisdom and flexibility, in a place where couples can make choices based on their actual needs, rather than medical pseudoscience or cultural pressure. But as we are about to discover, the story is far from over. Because right now, in the 21st century, we are seeing something remarkable. A resurgence of interest in sleeping separately. Sleep divorce, it is being called. And it is being driven not by Victorian medical fears, but by very modern concerns about sleep quality, health, and the recognition that self-care is not selfish. The separate bed debate is being reopened, but this time with better science, more honest communication, and hopefully more respect for individual variation. The question is no longer should couples sleep together or apart, but rather, how do we figure out what works for each unique relationship? History has a way of circling back on itself. Here we are in 2025 and suddenly everyone is talking about sleeping separately again. Except this time we are calling it sleep divorce, and this time the conversation is completely different. Scroll through social media and you will find thousands of posts from couples proudly declaring that they sleep in separate rooms. Celebrities are opening up about it. Sleep scientists are endorsing it. Marriage therapists are saying it might actually save relationships. The Victorians wanted separate beds for all the wrong reasons. But are we rediscovering separate beds for the right ones? Let us look at what is actually happening. In 2023, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine conducted a survey that made headlines. They found that more than 1/3 of Americans, 35%, said they occasionally or consistently sleep in a different room from their partner. That is up from about 25% just a decade earlier. The trend is growing and growing fast. But here is what makes this modern movement different from the Victorian one. It is being driven by actual sleep science, not pseudoscience. It is being chosen by individuals, not prescribed by doctors, and it is happening in the context of relationships where both partners have equal say, at least in theory. Dr. Wendy Troxell, a senior behavioral scientist at the Rand Corporation and a sleep specialist, has become one of the leading voices advocating for what she calls sleep individualism. In her 2021 book Sharing the Covers, she argues that the cultural expectation that couples must share a bed is actually harmful to many relationships, not because bed sharing is inherently bad, but because forcing it on couples who would sleep better apart creates unnecessary stress. Troxell cites research showing that when one partner has disrupted sleep due to the other partner's snoring, movement, or schedule differences, both partners suffer. The person being disturbed obviously sleeps poorly, but the person causing the disturbance often feels guilty, which creates its own stress. Over time, this pattern can erode relationship satisfaction more effectively than sleeping in separate rooms ever could. A 2016 study from Paracelsus Private Medical University in Germany found that couples who slept poorly together reported lower relationship quality, increased conflict, and reduced ability to resolve disagreements. The mechanism is straightforward. Sleep deprivation makes people irritable, reduces emotional regulation, and impairs cognitive function. When you are exhausted, everything is harder, including being patient with your partner. So the science is clear. For some couples, sleeping separately leads to better sleep, which leads to better mood, which leads to a better relationship. But notice that qualifier. For some couples, not all, this is not a universal prescription. It is an option that works for certain people in certain circumstances. And that brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of the modern sleep divorce movement. It is happening in a cultural moment that values self-care, boundaries, and individual well-being in ways that previous generations did not. The language people use to talk about sleeping separately now is all about taking care of yourself so you can be a better partner. Cameron Diaz, the actress, made waves in 2020 when she said in an interview, "We should normalize separate bedrooms. I think we should normalize separate bedrooms. I have my house, you have yours. We have the bedroom in the middle that we can convene in for our relations." She was half joking, but the response was fascinating. Some people agreed enthusiastically, others were horrified, but everyone was talking about it. Similarly, Carson Daly, the television host, revealed on the Today Show in 2019 that he and his wife sleep in separate rooms. He explained, "We sleep apart, we're not weird, we just prefer it that way." He went on to describe how his wife is an early riser and he works late nights. Their schedules are incompatible. Sleeping separately allows each of them to get the rest they without compromising the other's sleep. What is notable about these celebrity revelations is the defensive tone. We are not weird. This does not mean we have a bad relationship. The stigma still exists, even as the practice becomes more common. People feel they have to justify a choice that should be straightforward. We sleep better this way. But let us talk about who is actually choosing sleep divorce and why. The data reveals some interesting patterns. Couples with young children report high rates of sleep separation, often one parent sleeping with a child who needs nighttime care. Couples where one partner has a medical condition like sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, or chronic pain. Couples with dramatically different work schedules, shift workers for instance, and increasingly, couples who simply have different sleep preferences and are no longer willing to compromise their health for the sake of appearances. There is also an interesting gender dimension to the modern sleep divorce conversation. Multiple surveys have found that women are more likely than men to report that they sleep better alone. A 2019 study published in Frontiers in Psychiatry found that women's sleep quality was more negatively affected by bed sharing than men's. The researchers theorized this might be because women are more attuned to sounds and movements during sleep, an evolutionary adaptation related to maternal vigilance. But there is also a social dimension. Women still do the majority of emotional labor in relationships and households, even when both partners work. Having a space that is entirely their own, where they can rest without being aware of anyone else's needs, can be profoundly restorative. Sleep divorce for some women is not just about better sleep. It is about reclaiming time and space where they do not have to be caregivers. Now, let us address the elephant in the room. What about sex and intimacy? This is the question everyone asks. If you sleep in separate beds or separate rooms, does that damage your sexual relationship? The research says not necessarily. In fact, some couples report that sleeping separately improves their sex life. Why? Because they have to be more intentional about physical intimacy. It does not just happen automatically because you're both in bed. You have to decide to seek each other out, which can create anticipation and desire. Dr. Wendy Troxell points out that conflating sleep and sex is actually a cultural choice, not a biological necessity. We assume that because people historically shared sleeping spaces, that sleep and sex must go together, she says. But sleep has one set of requirements: a cool, dark, quiet environment, minimal disruption, and sex has completely different requirements. Why should one space have to serve both functions? Some couples with separate bedrooms create a third space, a guest room or one partner's room designated as the intimacy room, where they come together for sex but do not necessarily sleep afterward. This allows them to prioritize both good sleep and good sex without compromising either. Others maintain date nights where they sleep together, treating shared sleeping as a special occasion rather than the default. One couple interviewed for a 2022 article in The Atlantic described sleeping together on weekends but separately during the work week. They said it made their weekend time together feel more precious and intentional. But we should also acknowledge the concerns about sleep divorce that critics raise. Some marriage therapists worry that physical distance can lead to emotional distance. That couples who do not share a bed might drift apart, might lose the casual intimacy of bedtime conversation, might find it easier to avoid resolving conflicts because they can just retreat to separate spaces. These concerns are not baseless. Sleeping together does provide opportunities for connection, the few minutes of conversation before sleep, the comfort of physical presence during the night, the shared experience of waking up together. For some couples, these moments are crucial to maintaining their bond. So the question becomes, how do couples who sleep separately maintain those opportunities for connection? The answer is intentionally. They have to be deliberate about creating time together. They have to make sure that sleeping separately is about better rest, not avoiding each other. And this brings us back to communication. The couples who make sleep divorce work are couples who talk openly about their needs, who check in regularly about whether the arrangement is working, who remain flexible and willing to adjust. It is not about following a rule. Whether that rule is always sleep together or always sleep apart, it is about ongoing negotiation and mutual respect. There is also an interesting economic dimension to modern sleep divorce that echoes the Victorian era in surprising ways. Just as wealthy Victorians could afford separate bedrooms while the poor could not, modern sleep divorce is more accessible to people with financial resources. You need enough space for separate sleeping areas. You need to be able to afford furnishing 2 bedrooms instead of 1. This creates a troubling inequality. The couples who might benefit most from sleep divorce, those living in cramped apartments dealing with multiple stressors, working punishing schedules, are least able to implement it. Meanwhile, wealthy couples with spacious homes can easily create separate sleeping spaces and all the health benefits that come with them. Some architects and developers are starting to respond to this. There are new home designs that include dual primary bedrooms, not a master bedroom and a guest room, but 2 equally sized, equally appointed bedrooms for a couple. These designs acknowledge that separate sleeping is not a luxury or a problem, but a legitimate choice that deserves to be built into housing design. But most people are working with existing housing stock that was designed with the assumption that couples share a bedroom. This means creative solutions, couples converting dining rooms or home offices into second bedrooms, using Murphy beds or daybed setups to create flexible sleeping spaces in small apartments. Now, let us talk about something that almost no one discusses: the role of technology in modern sleep divorce. Our bedrooms are filled with devices that did not exist in the Victorian era, or even 30 years ago. Smartphones, tablets, TVS, smart home systems. And these devices are impacting how we sleep and how we share or do not share sleeping spaces. A 2024 study from the Sleep Foundation found that arguments about technology use in bed are a major source of conflict for modern couples. One partner wants to scroll through social media, the other wants the lights off and silence. One partner falls asleep to television, the other finds it disruptive. These conflicts did not exist in previous generations. Some couples are choosing sleep divorce specifically to avoid these conflicts. I can watch my shows, he can have his silence, and we're both happier, one woman told a researcher. Technology has created new incompatibilities that separate sleeping can resolve. But technology has also created new ways to maintain connection, despite physical separation. Couples who sleep apart can text goodnight messages. They can use video calls if one partner travels. They can share sleep data from fitness trackers and compare notes on sleep quality. Technology that disrupts shared sleeping can also support separate sleeping. There is even a Japanese cultural practice that is getting renewed attention in the West. Families where mothers sleep with children and fathers sleep separately. This co-sleeping arrangement is common in Japan and is not seen as indicating marital problems. In fact, it is viewed as prioritizing children's security and mothers' ability to respond to nighttime needs. Some Western families are adopting this approach, especially during the intense early years of parenting. The parent doing nighttime childcare sleeps with the child. The other parent sleeps separately and gets undisturbed rest. They trade off on weekends or adjust as children grow. This prioritizes both child development and parental well-being, rather than maintaining a romantic ideal of couples always sleeping together. So where does this leave us? We have circled back to separate sleeping, but the journey has taught us things the Victorians never knew. We know that sleep is essential for health. We know that people have different sleep needs and preferences. We know that there is no single correct way for couples to arrange their sleeping spaces, and ideally, we know that both partners should have equal say in making these decisions. The Victorian separate bed era failed because it was based on bad science, and enforced without regard for individual preferences or relationship dynamics. The modern sleep divorce movement has the potential to succeed because it is based on good science and chosen by couples who are making informed decisions about their own well-being. But success requires something challenging, letting go of cultural scripts about what relationships should look like, accepting that your relationship can be healthy and happy even if it does not match the idealized image of couples snuggling together every night. Having the courage to prioritize actual rest over romantic symbolism. Can we do that? Can we learn from the Victorian mistake without making a new mistake of our own? Can we create a culture where couples feel free to sleep together or apart based on what actually works for them, without stigma either way? That is the challenge we face, and the answer will determine whether modern sleep divorce becomes a liberating choice or just another source of anxiety and judgment. As we reach the end of our journey through 150 years of bedroom history, one question remains. What have we actually learned? What wisdom can we extract from this strange saga of Victorian medical fears, furniture marquee, Hollywood censorship, and modern sleep science? Because if we cannot find meaning and practical guidance in this story, then it is just an entertaining historical curiosity. But I believe there are profound lessons here about science, society, relationships, and the eternal challenge of balancing individual needs with partnership. Let us gather those lessons together and see what they can teach us about how to live now. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the bedrooms of history. We have travelled from medieval communal sleeping to Victorian separation, from Hollywood twin beds to modern sleep divorce. And if you are waiting for me to tell you the right way to sleep with your partner, I am going to disappoint you, because that is precisely the lesson. There is no universal right way, but there are lessons. Oh, are there lessons? Lesson number 1. Be extremely skeptical when anyone claims there is only one correct way to live your intimate life. The Victorians were so certain. Doctors wrote with absolute confidence that sleeping together would drain your vitality and spread disease. Furniture makers proclaimed that modern scientific people slept separately. Society insisted that respectable couples maintained separate beds. And they were wrong, spectacularly, expensively, tragically wrong. But notice how convincing they were. They had medical authorities. They had scientific-sounding theories. They had economic interests backing them up. They had social pressure enforcing conformity. The entire apparatus of culture was aligned to make separate beds seem not just advisable but essential. And yet beneath all of that certainty, the science was nonsense. Miasma theory was false. Vitality drain was fiction. The medical justifications evaporated as soon as anyone actually studied how disease transmission works. This should make us humble about our own certainties. Right now in 2025, we have our own confident pronouncements about how relationships should work. We have our own experts and influencers telling us the right way to structure our lives. And some of them are probably just as wrong as the Victorian doctors, but we cannot see it yet because we are living inside our own cultural moment. So when someone tells you that couples must sleep together to be truly intimate, be skeptical. When someone tells you that sleeping separately is always a sign of problems, be skeptical. When anyone presents a single solution as universally correct, ask yourself, whose interest does this serve? What are they not telling me? What complexity are they erasing? Lesson number 2. Economic incentives shape culture more than we like to admit. The Victorian furniture industry made enormous profits from convincing couples to buy 2 beds instead of 1. They sponsored research, they funded medical institutions, they advertised relentlessly, they created payment plans to make twin beds accessible, and they successfully transformed a medical recommendation into a cultural norm that lasted for generations. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply capitalism doing what capitalism does, finding opportunities to sell products and then creating demand for those products through marketing and cultural influence. We like to think we're immune to this. We like to believe our choices are purely rational, based on our authentic preferences. But we are all influenced by the messages we absorb from advertisements, from social media, from the cultural environment we swim in. Right now, there are industries that benefit from you sleeping apart. Mattress companies selling 2 sets of bedding, furniture makers selling dual bedroom setups, sleep technology companies selling devices to track individual sleep. And there are industries that benefit from you sleeping together, romantic getaway destinations, luxury bedding marketed to couples, relationship counseling services that emphasize physical closeness. None of this means their products are bad or their advice is wrong. It just means we should be aware that economic incentives exist and they shape the information environment we live in. When you make choices about your sleeping arrangements, try to distinguish between what actually serves your well-being and what you've been sold. Lesson number 3. Medical science should inform our choices, not dictate them. The Victorian mistake was not that they consulted doctors, it was that they treated medical recommendations as absolute rules that applied equally to everyone regardless of individual circumstances. Modern sleep science is genuinely useful. We know more about sleep now than at any point in human history. We understand circadian rhythms, sleep stages, the health impacts of sleep deprivation. We know that some people genuinely sleep better alone while others sleep better with a partner. We know that sleep quality affects mental health, physical health, relationship quality. This knowledge is valuable. Use it. If you are sleeping poorly, look at the research. Consider whether your sleeping arrangement might be contributing to the problem. Experiment with changes. Track your sleep quality. Be empirical, but remember that you are an individual, not a statistic. The research shows averages and correlations, not universal laws. What works for most people might not work for you. What the studies recommend might not fit your specific situation. The Victorian doctors forgot that behind every medical guideline is an actual human being with unique circumstances, preferences, and needs. Do not make the same mistake. Let science inform your choices, but make your choices based on your actual experience, not just on what studies say people like you usually prefer. Lesson number 4. Power imbalances matter. Always. Throughout this story, we have seen how separate sleeping arrangements intersected with gender inequality. Victorian women could not legally refuse their husbands or control their own property. The separate bedroom was sometimes a protection, sometimes an isolation, but always existed within a system where men had final authority. Modern sleep divorce is different because, at least in principle, both partners have equal say. But do they really? Are both partners equally free to express their preferences? Does one partner's career or schedule take priority over the other's? Who makes the final decision if partners disagree? These questions matter. A sleeping arrangement that is mutually chosen reflects a healthy relationship where both partners' needs are valued. A sleeping arrangement that one partner imposes on the other, or that one partner accepts reluctantly to avoid conflict, reflects inequality that probably shows up in other areas of the relationship too. So if you are considering changing your sleeping arrangements, pay attention to the process. Is this a genuine negotiation? Are both partners being honest about their preferences? Is there space for both people to express concerns without fear of judgment or retaliation? The conversation itself reveals as much about relationship health as the final decision does. Lesson number 5. Cultural narratives are powerful, but they're not destiny. For nearly a century, Victorian separate beds were the norm for people who could afford them. Then Hollywood froze that arrangement in place for another 40 years through censorship. That is multiple generations living with sleeping arrangements that were based on bad science and moral panic. But culture changed. Medical understanding improved. Women gained rights. Young people challenged their parents' assumptions, and the twin bed norm collapsed relatively quickly once enough people decided it no longer served them. This shows both the power of cultural narratives and their fragility. For decades, separate beds seemed permanent, natural, the way things had always been and always would be, until suddenly they were not. Right now, we have cultural narratives about relationships, about marriage, about what constitutes a healthy partnership. Some of those narratives serve us well, others constrain us unnecessarily, and we have more power than we think to question them, to reject the ones that do not fit, to create new narratives that better reflect how we actually want to live. The Victorian bedroom story is ultimately a story about liberation, not the liberation of sleeping together or sleeping apart, but the liberation of being able to choose for yourself rather than following a script written by people who do not know you, do not live your life, and do not have to deal with the consequences of their rules. Lesson number 6. Authenticity is harder than it looks. The Victorian era was notorious for the gap between public presentation and private reality. Respectable couples with separate bedrooms and perfect manners, some of whom were profoundly unhappy or living entirely separate lives behind closed doors. The performance of propriety mattered more than actual well-being. We like to think we have moved beyond this. We value authenticity. We say we want people to be real, to be honest, to stop pretending. But how authentic are we actually being? If you are sleeping separately but hiding it from friends and family because you're embarrassed, that is not authentic. If you're sleeping together but resenting it because you actually prefer to sleep alone, that is not authentic either. If you're making choices based on what you think you should want, rather than what you actually want, you're still performing. True authenticity means being honest with yourself about your needs and preferences, honest with your partner about what is and is not working, and brave enough to make choices that serve your actual well-being, even if they do not match cultural expectations. This is hard, it takes courage, it risks judgment, but it is also the path to relationships that are genuinely satisfying rather than just appearing satisfactory from the outside. Lesson number 7. Sleep matters more than we have been taught to believe. This might be the most practical lesson of all. We live in a culture that glorifies busyness, that treats sleep as a luxury, that encourages us to sacrifice rest for productivity. We stay up late working, scrolling, binge watching. We pride ourselves on functioning on minimal sleep. But the research is unequivocal. Sleep deprivation is terrible for you. It impairs cognitive function, weakens immune response, increases risk of chronic disease, damages mental health, and erodes relationship quality. When you are exhausted, everything is harder. You have less patience, you make worse decisions, you feel worse physically and emotionally. The Victorian doctors were wrong about myasma and vitality drain, but they were right that sleep is essential for health. They just prescribed the wrong solution for some people. If your sleeping arrangement is preventing you from getting adequate rest, whether that arrangement is sleeping together or sleeping apart, that is a serious problem worth addressing. Not because of abstract principles about how relationships should work, but because sleep deprivation is genuinely harmful and you deserve to be well rested. So pay attention to your sleep quality. Track it if you need to. Be honest about whether you're actually resting well or just pretending everything is fine. and be willing to make changes if your current arrangement is not serving your health. Lesson number 8. Relationships require ongoing negotiation, not one-time decisions. Here is something we have seen throughout this story. Sleeping arrangements are not static. Medieval families slept communally, then separately as they gained resources. Victorian couples started with separate beds, then some came back together later in life. Modern couples might share a bed for years, then separate during a period of health issues, then return to sharing once the issue resolves. Your needs change, your partner's needs change, your circumstances change. What works at age 25 might not work at age 45. What works when you are healthy might not work when you are ill. What works before children might not work after children arrive. This means that decisions about sleeping arrangements should not be made once and then frozen in place forever. They should be revisited periodically. Is this still working for both of us? Have our needs changed? Do we need to adjust? This ongoing negotiation is actually what healthy relationships look like. Not perfect harmony where both partners always want exactly the same thing, but rather continuous communication and willingness to adapt as circumstances change. And finally, lesson number 9. The most intimate act is not sleeping together, it is being honest with each other. We have spent this entire story exploring physical sleeping arrangements. But underneath all of it is a deeper question. Can you be vulnerable with your partner? Can you express needs without fear of rejection? Can you have difficult conversations? Can you prioritize both people's well-being, even when that requires compromise? Victorian couples often could not have these conversations. The culture did not permit that kind of honesty. Men and women inhabited such separate spheres, had such different expectations placed on them, that genuine intimacy was rare even in marriages that lasted decades. We have the opportunity to do better. We have more equality, not perfect, but more than our ancestors had. We have better language for talking about needs and boundaries. We have relationship models that emphasize communication and mutual respect, but having the opportunity does not mean we automatically take advantage of it. Real intimacy requires courage. It requires being willing to say, I am not sleeping well, even if you are worried your partner will be hurt. It requires listening when your partner expresses needs that do not match your assumptions. It requires valuing your partner's actual well-being over the appearance of a perfect relationship. That is the real lesson here. Not whether you should sleep together or apart, but whether you can be honest with each other about what you need, whether you can negotiate differences with respect and care, whether you can prioritize genuine well-being over cultural performance. So where does this leave you personally right now, tonight? If you are in a relationship and you are sleeping well and you're happy with your arrangement, wonderful. Keep doing what works. Do not let anyone tell you that you should change just because someone else has different preferences. But if you are not sleeping well, or if you suspect your partner is not sleeping well, have a conversation. A real conversation. Not we should do this because I read an article, but rather, how is this actually working for you? Are you getting the rest you need? What could we try differently? And if you are sleeping separately and feeling guilty or worried about what it means, consider whether that guilt is based on actual problems in your relationship or just on cultural expectations that do not fit your situation. Maybe sleeping separately is exactly what you need. Maybe it is making your relationship better by ensuring both partners are well rested and happier. That is legitimate. That is okay. The Victorian bedroom story teaches us that following cultural rules does not guarantee happiness, and breaking those rules does not guarantee disaster. What matters is whether your choices serve your actual well-being and whether they are made through honest communication and mutual respect. As we close this journey, I want you to think about one more thing. The Victorians could not see that their certainties were wrong because they were living inside them. Their medical theories, their social expectations, their economic systems all reinforced each other, creating a reality that seemed natural and inevitable. We are also living inside systems we cannot fully see. We also have certainties that future generations will find baffling or tragic. We also have cultural norms that serve some interests while harming others. The best we can do is remain curious, stay skeptical of universal prescriptions, pay attention to our actual experiences rather than our assumptions, and remember that cultural change is possible. The Victorian bedroom culture seemed permanent until it was not. Our current norms seem natural until they are not. History is not just about the past. It is about recognizing patterns, understanding how change happens, and realizing that we have more agency than we think to shape the world we live in. Every couple that makes authentic choices about their sleeping arrangements rather than following a script is participating in cultural change. Every conversation that prioritizes actual well-being over appearances is a small act of resistance against systems that value conformity over human flourishing. The Victorian women who claimed separate beds for autonomy, the couples who defied Hollywood censorship by sharing beds in reality, even when they could not on screen, the modern couples who sleep separately despite stigma, all of them are part of the same story. The story of humans trying to figure out how to live authentically, how to take care of themselves and each other, how to create relationships that genuinely serve their well-being rather than just looking good from the outside. So tonight, when you go to bed, whether alone or with a partner, whether in a shared bed or a separate room, remember that you are part of this long history. Your choices matter. Your well-being matters. Your relationship is yours to shape, not society's to dictate. Sleep well, sleep however works for you, and wake up tomorrow with the confidence that comes from making authentic choices rather than following rules that were never designed for your actual life. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history's bedrooms. It has been a strange, surprising, revealing exploration of how something as simple as where we sleep can tell us so much about science, society, power, intimacy, and the eternal challenge of being human. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. I hope it made you think. I hope it maybe changed how you see your own choices and your own relationship. And I hope above all that it reminded you that you have more freedom than you think to live in ways that genuinely serve you, rather than ways that simply serve cultural expectations. Until next time, may your sleep be restful, your relationships honest, and your choices authentic. Good night.